Go. All right. So we are live. Ladies and gentlemen, we're back for Scholars 20 for 20. This is number 19. 19. Very important. And I have today Dr. Benite. I'm not even going to try and pronounce his name and chop it up and mess up the whole interview, but you will see his name in the title spelled out. All right. Dr. Benite, we were talking before and everything, but can you tell us a little about your history as far as who you are and where you're from and, what do you do?
Thank you, Brother Garfield. I'm Garfield. I'm very honored to be here in this forum, which is a little unusual for me. I was born in Jerusalem in 1966 to a family that came to Jerusalem a few years before that from Iraq. So I grew up in a kind of a bilingual city and in a bilingual city setting of Arabic and Hebrew. And at some point, I became very much interested in the history of China. So I studied the history of China. And I became very much infatuated with the culture of Islam in China. So I studied that first. And I also became a specialist of Asian Islam. And I wrote a book about, the culture and the philosophies and the histories of the Muslims in China many years ago. And then I needed to write, when I came to NYU, I needed to write another book, which was a bit of a world history. So I was looking for a myth or a story that was circulating all over the world, getting different shapes, having different people claiming it, different people identifying with it. So this is how I came to the question of the lost tribes or the 10 lost tribes. But my book did not really tell every single history of every group, from Japan to South America that claims connections to the lost tribes. It was mostly focusing on how this story shaped the way we think about geography. Because there are two questions about the 10 tribes. One question, of course, there's the biblical matter that we're going to discuss in a few minutes, but one question is who? In other words, who on earth are the people? Okay. The second question is where. In other words, where are they? And that means that, you need to talk about global geography. And most of the time, you don't really know every place in the world. So every time that people discover the place, they discovered the American continent, they discovered the Japanese islands, they discovered islands in the Pacific, they say, okay, maybe here we will find the lost tribes. Okay. Now, of course, why everybody is so obsessed with that, in Europe in the beginning of the age of discovery and the age of sail, they are obsessed with that because there is a messianic promise and there is a biblical blessing that if these people are supposed to come back, then the end of time will come with them. Okay. Now, some people are very scared about that. For them, it's going to be an apocalypse. For others, this is a big promise because it will end their suffering and their misery. So because of that promise, people were looking for them all over the place, and even inventing continents to put them there, just to find them. Okay. So this is a little bit of who I am and how I came to this project myself.
Fascinating. And by the way, you said you were born in Israel in 1966. This is important. Not too much for the topic, but excuse me. You might actually be, in my opinion, because when people talk about descendants of ancient Israelites, people are descendants of literal historical Israelites. Your family grew up in Iraq, which is ancient Babylon.
Yeah.
And if you know the history, you're talking about the first deportation with Tiglath-Pileser or Shalmaneser V or
Sargon II.
Right, Sargon II, and then you have Sennacherib in he claimed he took 200,000. You're gonna get into that a little bit.
Yeah.
And you talk about Nebuchadnezzar encouraging, based on modern day archaeology, the Al Yahuda tablets, he invited Jews to come and live in Babylon. Some who rebelled, the vassal kings, he took them by force, but he actually offered Jews land. And you possibly are a descendant of the people who lived in Babylon. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that Iraqi Jews like to be proud of, that they have a 2,500 years continue of history in the land of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Assyria, and modern day Iraq. Now, I do not know if I can claim that, you know, my family lived in the same location for 2,500 years. You know, maybe they migrated from other places and so on. You know, my brother, he did this like DNA stuff, and the result came up that, you know, he's that he is 10% Italian. You know. Okay. And my cousin did it with another company, and he came up with a result that it says 98% Northern Iraqi Jew. Yes.
Wow. So you know what company that was? What company was that?
One was 23andMe, and one was the other one. I don't know. I forgot the name. Yes. Okay. And of course, we are of this. We're supposed to be of the same genetic material, so I don't know exactly. However, it is true that Mesopotamia is one of the places that through archaeology and text, you can establish that there was a continuous Jewish presence from the 6th century, yes, BCE, all the way to the present, to until 1950, 1951, and a bit later to that. You know, there was a very, very big community. Most of them were expelled or had to leave, you know, after the creation of the state of Israel. So I don't know if I can claim 2,500 years of being in one place, which would be interesting, but there was a continuous Jewish presence in this country, you know, for that. And, you know, they now discovered all sorts of archaeological sites in which you see peasants in different locations, particularly in locations where, you know, apparently the prophet Ezekiel lived, and so
the Kebar River, by the
Kebar River, yeah, in the place called Tel Aviv. You know, I mean, people don't know that, but Tel Aviv actually is in Babylonia, not in Israel.
A lot of people don't realize that at all. Yeah. And thanks for clearing that up. Yeah. Let's start this way.
Yes.
The lost tribes. How do we get to have a lost tribes at the beginning? How do we get there?
Yeah. So first of all, you know, this is the interesting, simple question. You know, why the lost tribes are important? Because they are lost. Yes. And when you don't find something, it's lost, and you keep looking for them. It seems to me that when we understand them as lost, we begin to understand them as lost because you have two, or theoretically, you have two Israelite groups. One is the people who are identified, you know, as Jews, and you see them in the street, and you identify them, and you know who they are. But then you have another Israelite group of 10 tribes, you know, that disappeared, and we know that they are somewhere on earth, but we don't know where they are. That makes them the lost ones, yes? And that makes the story circulating in different locations. Now, when I say, you know, the people who are identified as Jews, you know, these are, of course, the people who may be living in different locations in the world and in Israel and other places and have been identified for centuries as Jews. But, you know, it doesn't mean, the point is that it's not that it's these people. The point is that they are visible, as opposed to other groups that live as invisible Israelites. Like, in other words, you need to do research, you need to discover their language, to discover the rituals, dig in and do that. And many people from India to China, all the way to the Americas, and of course in Africa, you know, were subjected to this kind of digging or ethnographies that, you know, were trying to reveal the fact that actually they are lost tribes, and to find them and move them from the condition of being lost to being found. But if we go back to the very, very beginning, we need to actually to learn, you know, how in fact in the Bible creates this group. Okay, so if we go to the Book of Kings, and I hope everybody can read. I put together very quick slides with the relevant biblical material.
Okay.
If we go to the book of Kings, so we are at the time of King David and Solomon, according to the story. And King Solomon is the second king of a very, very big kingdom of all the tribes, all the 12 tribes, the children of Jacob or Israel. And towards the end of his life, he begins to sin. He marries a lot of women and he's exposed to different religions and cultures, and he begins to worship different idols. And God is angry with that. And God send up a prophet whose name is Ahiah. And he tells Ahiah to go to a man from the tribe of Ephraim, which is the largest tribe in the north. This man is called Yeravam or Jeroboam. And he says to him, go tell him, that I'm going to tear the kingdom and I'm going to leave with the house of David in Jerusalem. I'm going to leave 2 tribes. And I'm in the new kingdom that I'm going to create, I'm going to give you 10 tribes. Now, why this is important? Because this is one of the only 2 places in the Bible that the term 10 tribes actually is mentioned. Okay, if we look at the phrase 10 tribes and so on. And if you can read here, in Kings 11, 30-32, he says, Ahiah laid, there's a very dramatic thing. Jeroboam is completely innocent. He's leaving Jerusalem he was working as an official for Solomon, and he's leaving Jerusalem out, and he's wearing a new dress. Yes, a new gown. And suddenly shows up the prophet of God, Ahiah, and he takes the dress and he tears it into 12 pieces, and he gives him 10, and he says, this is going to be you, yes, and 2 I'm going to keep to the house of David and the tribe of Judah in Jerusalem. And if you can see here, in fact, this is a painting, from the early 18th century by a Dutch painter, how he imagines that. So you can see Jerusalem at the background, and you can see Jeroboam completely astonished with what's going on. And the prophet says, this is going to be your kingdom. Okay. But then things become a little complicated. Solomon dies. His son comes to power. The 10 tribes in the north rebel. They establish their own kingdom. As God prophesied, by Ahiah, Jeroboam becomes the king. And as the Bible continues the story, and he says, okay, you should continue to worship in the temple in Jerusalem, even though you're now an independent kingdom. But Jeroboam says to himself, if my people will go to continue to worship in Jerusalem, they might revert back to the house of David, and I'm going to lose my kingdom. So then the Bible tells us that he does 2 things. He builds a golden calf. And if you know anything about the story of Exodus, you know that the golden calf is the worst thing that you can do. Yes, he builds 2 golden calves. One he puts in the city of Beth El, not far from Jerusalem, and another one he puts in the north, in the territory of the tribe of Dan, and he says, "These are your God. This is your God, Israel." Yes. Now, which is interesting thing about the bull and the calf. Like these are like very, very powerful divinities in the ancient Near East. And then Ahiah shows up again, and he's very, very angry, and he delivers another terrible prophecy, which I have here in 2 Kings 14, 16. He says, "Go tell Jeroboam, thus said the Lord God of Israel, for as much as I exalted thee from among the people," in other words, I made you king, yes, and I rented my king, and I divided the kingdom, and I gave it to, and I gave you the 10 tribes. Now you have done evil in my eyes. You molded images to provoke me, and so on and so forth. And then he says in verse 10, says, "Therefore, behold, I will bring evil upon the house of Jeroboam, and I will cut off Jeroboam, every man child, and that is shut on him, that is left as large as Israel, and will utterly sweep away the house of Jeroboam as a man sweepeth away dung, till it will all be gone." Okay, and this is a very, very dramatic thing, because what happens is that he indeed dies, But the Bible tells us that the people of Israel continued to worship the golden calf, and they continued to make God angry. And then he said, okay, one day I'm going to come and get rid of you. Okay, and I'm going to send you to another land, and you will live there in exile forever, forever, forever. Okay, so that happens theoretically, like sometimes in the 9th century, 10th century BCE. Okay, but in the 8th century, and now we're talking moving from the Bible story to history, to real history. In the 8th century, we see the rise of an empire in the east, in Mesopotamia, yes, and this is the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire, what it does is a sort of a kind of a globalization of the old world. They conquer a lot of territories, and other territories they in fact incorporate as provinces, okay? And they engage in trade, and they engage in, they develop the place and so on. But another thing that they do is they do a lot of wars and a lot of deportations, okay? And we're going to finish that in a quick second. So what matters to us is, in fact, the stories that the stories that, that happened in this area that we learn from archaeology, Mesopotamian archaeology from the 19th century on, is that they indeed invaded the kingdom of Israel or the kingdom of the 10 tribes at least 3 times. And the most decisive invasion was in the year 721, 720 BCE with Sargon II, and which is one of the greatest kings, and he destroys the city of Samaria. Okay, you can see this is another map. I'm going to come back to it in a minute as well. He destroys the city of Samaria, and he deports the people, but he doesn't deport all the people. He deports about a little over 20,000 people, okay? Now, let's forget for a second the story of the Bible and ask ourselves, why did the Assyrian Empire deport the people, okay? Well, this is something that empires do, They like to take people, uproot them, and move them somewhere else for several reasons. One is because, this is how they pacify the territory. If you take away the people, yes, or do you break the bone of the society, yes, the skilled people, the people who, the soldiers, the princes, the aristocracy, and you move them somewhere else, in the new place, they're going to be completely vulnerable. And in the place where the place that you just conquered and you took them away, it's going to be, they won't be able to resist this occupation that is now besieged upon them. So the Assyrians engage, and the Babylonians afterwards, they do the same thing. The Assyrians engage in large-scale acts of deportation all over the Near East. Not just the Israelites, but we learn about Damascus, and we learn from Assyrian sources about, Arabian tribes, etc., etc., etc. Archaeologists and scholars estimate that there were 157 cases of deportations of people, okay? Not just Israelites, all sorts of people. And between 1.5 million and 4.5 million people actually were moved into different locations. Now, this is a very, very large-scale operation. And they do this because they have a large empire, and they want to settle people in different locations to increase the stability from their point of imperial view, okay? And I'm going back to some of the slides, but you can see something. If you look at in Nineveh, in their capital, you find stuff like this. Assyrian war chariots with conquered people. You see the people are trying to resist them, but they're coming and they run them over. And when they run them over, they begin to deport them. They put them on other chariots, and then they exile them. They send them away. And you can see this one. This is, for example, from the after the Sennacherib invasion to Judah after the Battle of Lachish in 701 BCE, and they actually describe how they deported people. Here are the people who are being deported, and if you look in other sites, you can see many images such as this one. But let's go back to the question of what happened with the Israelites. Okay. First of all, when Sargon invaded the kingdom of Israel, okay, he sacked the city of Samaria or Samaria, and he says as follows. This is the cylinder. This is a stylite that he created after this victory. He was, of course, very, very proud of that. And he says, he left two of us, and they are almost identical in their style. He says, I besieged and conquered Samaria. I took his booty, 2,290 people who lived there. I gathered 50 chariots from them, and we could see the chariots in the other stuff that I just showed. And I taught the rest of the deportees their skills. In other words, he trained them in skills that he wanted them to do for him. And we have now evidence, that some of them were actually served as cooks in his army elsewhere in different places in Armenia and so on. Okay. I set my governor over them. In other words, he installed his own governor. He creates the place. It used to be an independent kingdom, but now it's a province. And then he says, and I imposed on them the same tribute as the previous king. In other words, now they're going to pay taxes for me and so on. Okay. Now, in another one, he says almost identical thing, although the number is slightly different. Instead of 27,290, he says 280. And I think precisely because of this mistake, we should assume that the number is more or less the same, okay? Because he doesn't exaggerate here. He gives you a kind of a rough, not exactly a rough estimate. And this is not all of the people. Historians and archaeologists estimate that in the kingdom of Israel, or the 10 tribes, about 300,000 people at the time. So he clearly maybe deported maybe 10%, not the entire nation. Okay, and you can read it as I speak. I'm not going to read all of that, but look at the end of what he says. He says, I settled the rest of them in the midst of Assyria. I repopulated Samaria more than before. In other words, he emptied the city, but he brought other people from elsewhere, deportees from elsewhere to that city. Yes, because this is part of their policies at the time as an empire. I brought into people from countries conquered by my hands, and I appointed my commissioner and governor over them, and I counted them as Assyrians. In other words, they become his own subjects. Okay. Now, this is a very straightforward, a big king, he says, I came in, I conquered, I resettled, I did everything. Now you pay my taxes. That's it. I'm the empire. Of course, he's convinced that he did it because the god of Assyria made him so successful. But we need to think about it in a different way now. The people who watch this in Jerusalem, they see that the city of Samaria in the north has been sacked by this mighty empire, okay? But they're the ones who are writing the Bible. They're the ones who are writing the story. And they're going to write it on their own terms. And what are their own terms? They say, well, you know why these people were deported and why they were punished and why they lost their kingdom? Because they were sinners. They want to teach you a lesson, okay? That's why we now begin to understand why all of these prophecies of Achaya, why they were in fact put in the biblical narrative to justify what happened and to explain what happened in the year 721, okay? They sit in Jerusalem and they get to write the record. We don't know the record of these Israelites, but we do see how the people in Jerusalem saw it. And let us read, in 2 Kings 17. So in 2 Kings 17, you have two things going on at the same time. One thing is kind of a very straightforward account of the various invasions of the Assyrians to the territory. So in verse 3, we read that, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came, and he basically made Hoshea his servant. In other words, he didn't conquer the place, but he showed up with his army and says, okay, now you're going to pay me taxes and you're going to report to me, okay? And then, Hoshea, who was the king of Israel at the time, he makes a mistake. He decided not to pay the taxes, and he makes a conspiracy with other kingdoms. Let's rebel. Okay, that's a big mistake. They think they're going to be helped by the kingdom of Egypt. So they say, okay, let's switch our alliances to the kingdom of Egypt. What? Big mistake. So the king of Assyria shows up, and he takes him as a prisoner. Still not a complete punishment. But then in verse 5, we read that the king of Assyria showed up again. And now this is Sargon II, but the Bible doesn't tell us it's Sargon II. Yes. And he comes again. And the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel. And pay attention here that he says carried Israel, in other words, carried all the 10 tribes, all of them, not 20,000. The Bible doesn't care about the number. It cares that the entire nation, because if the entire nation sinned, the entire nation is going to be punished. That's key. Okay, and carried Israel away to Assyria and placed them in Halach, in Habor, in the river of Gozan, and in the cities of Medes. Okay, so this is kind of a historical account, but pay attention what happens in verse 7. In verse 7, the biblical author suddenly remembers that he's not a historian, he's a theologian. Okay, he's not just writing you a history. He doesn't want to get a job in teaching history in a university. He wants to teach you a lesson. And then he says, and this was because the children of Israel had sinned against God. Yes, the Lord, their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had feared the gods. And then he says, okay, they walked with the statutes of the nations, etc., etc., etc. So that is the key issue here. And this is why we understand also that the biblical author is not very much interested in the details the way Sargon is, 20,280, 20,290, He is interested in teaching you a lesson. And if everybody was a sinner, then the entire nation was carried out, okay? So that's part of, this is a powerful story. Now, just to finish that part.
Before you move any further, I hope people are paying attention. There's a difference between a theological writing and somebody writing from a historical perspective. And I think that's where a lot of the arguments in academia sometimes, because if you're a believer, like a William Albright, who was just a stone cold believer of the Bible and said, hey, I'm gonna dig and find all the truths of the Bible, or a Finkelstein point of view, like I'm gonna go wherever the evidence leads. That's the clash a lot of times in academia. And a lot of people, like you see, you going into a school, you could have your own faith. We're not debating anybody about their faith. You believe whatever you believe, that's your own business. Yeah. But as far as from an academia perspective, I love how you're breaking it down. Like, hey, now in verse 7, look at what he says. All of a sudden now he remembers, hey, I'm trying to justify why this happened to you. So this is what I tell people, Dr. Benite. Yeah. The Bible is telling you who you are, where you are, what happened, why you are in the position you're in, and how you could get out of it by following Yahweh and his teachings. That's it. That's all the Bible is. It's going to tell you some story, how God punished you, and the reason why he did it, because you didn't follow our laws. It don't mean it's true. It's a theological writing.
Yes.
You know what they're doing.
Yes, which is a matter of faith. Because if tomorrow morning archaeologists will find, some evidence that shows that the entire thing, never happened, it will never matter to the believers, because they don't need to know. They need to believe.
I love that. I love that.
They don't need to know. They need to believe. Mm-hmm. So in this context, when we read the Bible, we need to always maintain this balance between, where it is like history or, a text that pretends to be history, and when it is a lesson. And it is very clear that at the end of the day, the lesson is more important than the historical detail. Yes. It's a very, very different concept of what we talk about today about history. Now, let's just finish that a very, very quick situation and see how, first of all, because before we find the lost tribes, we need to lose them. Yes, we have to lose them.
By the way, Dr. Benite, you can't be lost if somebody knows where you are. That's another.
Yes.
Well, go ahead, continue.
Yes. So now, as we know from the biblical story, okay, the people in Jerusalem, they sit down, they realize what's going on, and so on. In fact, they have this unique experience where they experience an Assyrian invasion themselves, because in 701, King Hezekiah, he has another very, very bad idea. He rebels against the king, Sennacherib, who came after Sargon. And Sennacherib sends an expedition all the way. He's already based, in fact, in the northern part of Israel. And he has his own governor even near Jerusalem himself, you know. But he says, okay, I'm going to have like a punitive expedition. These people are, you know, these small people think that they, you know, they can rebel against me. So he sent a punitive expedition. There is a battle, very important battle in Lachish, that, you know, if you go to the British Museum, because, you know, British archaeologists found it in Nineveh and then removed it, you know, this is the interesting part of it. If you really want to see, you know, the history of the Middle East, sometimes you have to go to Europe. So they you stand in front of that thing and you see a description of the entire battle very, very clearly from his point of view. But from what we want to know, what really interests us is something that happens in Jerusalem after Lachish. So he destroys the city of Lachish, which is in southern Israel, and he comes with his army to Jerusalem. And he puts a siege on Jerusalem. And it's quite fascinating to think what happened, because you have an Assyrian general speaking to the people on the walls, and he offers them a deal. Yes, his name is Rav Shakeh. And by the way, this man speaks Hebrew, okay, which may be that he actually could be an Israelite. Some scholars actually do think that he was an Israelite himself. You know, from the people who conquered 20 years before, he got a job as, you know, a propagandist in the Sennacherib army. So he stands there and he says, okay, you people of Jerusalem, now we're coming here to punish you. We lay a siege. Why don't you open the walls? And if you open the walls and surrender, yes, I'm going to make a deal with you. And let's read here, you know, how he talks about it. It's really fascinating. He says, look, hearken not to Hezekiah, for thus said the king of Assyria. Okay, so he's delivering the message of the king. Make your peace with me and come out with me and eat ye everyone his vine, everyone his of his fig tree, and drink ye every one of the waters of your own cistern. In other words, if you surrender, we're not going to destroy the city, okay? Until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of corn and wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and of honey, that ye may live and not die, and hunker not unto Hezekiah, etc., etc., etc. In other words, what is the deal that he's offering them? He says, look, you're not going to get away without a deportation. I'm going to deport you. But there are two ways we're going to do this. One way, I'm going to enter the city, destroy your temple, kill a lot of people, and then take you away. Or you surrender now, I'm going to go back home, and then in 2 years, I'm going to come back and peacefully transfer you, because, you know, you're going to get punished, because the imperial policy is that we're going to deport you. Okay. Now, there's something very interesting in that part, because I think that the biblical author actually really, maybe this speech wasn't given in the same way we hear it now, you know. And there's a moment, if you read this chapter, in the entire chapter in the Bible, you can see that the leaders of Jerusalem are very, very frightened when he makes that deal, you know, when he speaks to the people on the walls, because they said, speak to us in Aramaic, don't speak to us in Judean or in Hebrew, which suggests that he actually spoke Hebrew to the people when he offered them that deal, okay? So maybe it wasn't in the exact same words, but I think that they were making that kind of deal with people. And I can give you an example from elsewhere in history just to illustrate that. If you heard, one of the things that I do a lot is the history of the Mongols. This is what I teach actually at NYU, is a lot of history of the Mongol Empire. And one of the things that you see with the Mongols is when they come to a city, you know, with Genghis Khan, they used to make a deal with the people. Say like, okay, either you open the gates and surrender peacefully, or, you know, you don't open the gates, you keep resisting, and then there will be a massacre, okay? So in other words, this is a practice that, you know, in siege warfare, you know, sometimes empire used to do that, okay? For example, Josephus tells us that when Titus came to the temple in Jerusalem, he tried to convince the people to surrender peacefully, okay? Of course, nothing is peaceful about it. This is occupation. But, you know, they try to minimize the bloodshed, you know, for their side and for the side of the people whom I'm going to victimize, okay? So even if this is not exactly true, it actually rings true in terms of the story itself, okay? This is probably why we can tell that the people in Jerusalem knew very well what happened in Samaria 20 years before, because they witnessed a version of it, an easy version of it themselves. Okay. Now, in 586, when we continue to read in the Bible, we read that, okay, the Assyrians were destroyed by the Babylonians, and now King Nebuchadnezzar come in 597 to Jerusalem because there is a rebellion against him, and he does not destroy the city. What he does, he takes the king, his mother, some of the princes, and all the people who are skilled blacksmiths. He takes them to Babylon. And this is a very, very rational imperial activity. He says, okay, I'm just going to send you a message. I'm going to take your leadership. I'm going to put another king from the family to make sure that you understand who's the boss. And everybody who can actually threaten me in terms of security, I'm going to take with me to Babylon. This is 597, and this is probably how the prophet Ezekiel got, which we mentioned before we started, got to Babylon. But of course, the Israelites, they're stubborn people. They never learn. Yes.
One question.
Yes.
I don't want you to leave off something. We have 2 Kings 18 on the screen, and that Sennacherib, when he had all them cities, he said he took the cities in verse 13. He talks about he took all of them away. Yeah. I think in the lost tribes conversation, I call it the lost, because I have a book coming out real soon. I call it chapter The Lost Tribes of Judah. Yes. And what I say that is because nobody in the lost tribes conversation talks about how many people Sennacherib took. He basically ran over the 46 cities. Yes. And then he said he took 200,000. I don't know if that's true, but of course he took a lot of people. And then on top of it, those people now, where are those people? They would be considered lost if we're talking about people that are lost. But because it's from the southern kingdom, they don't talk about it.
They don't talk about it. I can tell you a little bit. Yeah. Now, about Sennacherib, of course, his first expedition failed, which I think why he exaggerates later in his own records. That's why he says 200,000. Okay, I believe, and I'm not an expert on that. I just read the literature of the experts as you do. I believe that what happened is that he did destroy the place. We know that there was a lot of destruction, particularly in the southern parts that are closer to the coast. Yes. And he did take a lot of people because we have all of the evidence, from archaeological finds. Certainly not 200,000, because there were not 200,000 in the kingdom, I think, at the time. It was a lot smaller. The water could not feed so many animals so that the people can live over it. Okay, but he took a lot of people, and you're right that they are also kind of lost because we don't know where they are. Yes, and here's the story about the back to the Babylonians. When the Babylonians take some of the people, and then when they come back in 586 after the second rebellion against them, they do destroy the temple, which is a form of common punishment. In other words, I'm going to come and I'm going to break your political leadership. That's the palace. And then I'm going to destroy your center of identity and, your focus of your religion, which is, of course, the temple. Okay? Which is, they do it all over the place to many people that they want to punish. And then they exile some more. But the Bible tells us that a lot of people actually stayed. Yes, they stayed because the Babylonians, like the Assyrians, they want to collect taxes. Okay, so if they deport all the people, who's going to work there and produce olive oil and wine so they can ship it to Babylonia and enjoy the taxes? So they keep them there and they say, go back to work, have your fees and go on. They are not interested in devastating the country economically. Okay, but here's something very, very strange. We have a prophecy that they will come back. And miraculously, yes, through history, when the Babylonians lose their empire to the Persians and Cyrus the Great comes to power, Cyrus the Great reverses the imperial policy of his predecessors. Instead of deporting, he's actually engaging in restoration. And he says to himself, okay, I just conquered Damascus, Jerusalem, all of these locations. How can I maintain that the leadership there will be loyal to me? Maybe I'm going to send some of these people who are now living in Babylon back to Jerusalem, tell them, okay, build your build your temple, you know, collect the taxes, organize the place, you know, for me, make sure that it's a good, nice behaving province. Yes. And and this is how I'm going to maintain the peace. So the Persians actually do it a lot. They practice this kind of multiculturalism, they allow a lot of people, and a lot of temples all over the Near East are being reestablished, you know, as a reversal of the earlier imperial policies, precisely because they want to establish their legitimacy not through punishment, but through favor. This is how Ezra and Nehemiah come to Jerusalem. They are sent back from Babylonia to this place. But, you know, the Bible tells us, okay, so the Jews have returned, and then we have a problem. Because if the prophecy says that all Israel, Isaiah promised that all Israel will come back after exile, suddenly, why is it that only 2 tribes returned, and where are the 10 tribes that did not return? And from that moment on, everybody's obsessed. If they did not return, where are they now? And now we can begin our conversation.
All right. So we're at the Babylonian time period, the Persian time period. All right. So what happens in the Greek time period? I mean, what do we see? We have a new book being put together, the Pentateuch being organized for the Greeks, and you know, there's still, you have the Samaritans who saying that they are the real people of the descendants, and the temple should be at Mount Gerizim. You had the Judean faction saying it should be Jerusalem, and you know, they have their little internal stuff going on. Where is the lost tribes before the Common Era? You're talking like from the 300 BC to the first century. What are we looking at that point?
Yeah, so in the Second Temple period, we begin to see the beginning of the obsession with with 2 questions. Why they did not return, and if they did not return, where are they now? And there are different sources that tell us that, okay? First of all, you know, in the Bible itself, you see evidence that they try to justify that they did not return. For example, you know, the verse in the Deuteronomy says, I shall throw them in another land. Okay, Eretz Acheret in Hebrew. Keep that. In other words, what is another land? Another land is a land that is very, very different from our earth as we know it. Okay, so that's one beginning of understanding that. The second form of sources is that you have a lot of apocryphal books that were written in Jerusalem, and they have a different theological message, you know, about different things, but they use the story of the lost tribes as a framework. And I'm not going to mention all of them, but I'm going to mention 2. One of them is the Apocalypse of Esdras, which pretends to be, Ezra, pretends to be the biblical Ezra, the one who was sent by the Persians to govern over Jerusalem.
Say it again. So this is somebody writing in the future, pretending to be Ezra of the past.
To be the Ezra of the past.
Okay.
And now, if we read in the Bible, in the biblical book of Ezra, so Ezra is leading the Jews from Babylonia to Jerusalem.
Right.
However, the author of the fake Ezra, many centuries later, he writes the book and he does something very, very different. He says, okay, those he took to Jerusalem, but what did he do with the 10 tribes? He took the 10 tribes and he led them to another land, okay? So in other words, the second book of Ezra, or the second book, the fake book of Ezra, yes, tells us that basically Ezra is a Moses in reverse. You know, the Jews he brings to Jerusalem, but that leaves us with a question like, where are the rest? Where are the 10 tribes? Okay, so part of his mission, and we didn't know it at the time, was to take them to that land. And there's a whole story how they had to cross a river, a legendary river, and they went there.
Right.
Yes. Now, of course, what they want, like as before, they want to teach you a theological lesson about, you know, the power of sin and the power of punishment. So they use it as a framework. But at the same time, they also say we might as well answer a very persistent question that everybody's obsessed with, which is where are the 10 tribes? So they say here, if you want to know what happened to them, just as Ezra brought us here, he took them there. Okay?
Right.
So
let me ask you this.
yes,
This whole you're talking about the whole Arzareth thing was actually a compound word from
yes,
Deuteronomy, which means another land. And,
yes,
and people in my community have made a whole new religion based off of Arzareth. And it's
yes,
crazy because the word, and you go into the Hebrew, I mean, you know, it comes from Deuteronomy, I think 30 or something to that effect. And it's talking about another land, which you told us a while ago to pay attention to. I know where you were going. And it's
yeah,
the same term used in the fake Ezra, and
yeah,
they pull it together and call it Arzareth, but it really is Eret something, and it means another land. Can
yeah.
you break
It
that
means
down for us?
Eretz Aheret means another land. Yes. Now, when we say another land, we can say two things. You know, another land as if you know the land nearby, or an other land. You know, completely other. Now, when the book was written, it was written, you know, I mean, it did not survive. If it was written in Hebrew, we don't know, but it did not survive. What it survived is when it was translated into Greek. And the Greek translator thought that the term another land is a name of that land. That's the thing. So it creates this compound and it becomes a name. And let me give you an example of why it is so powerful. This is a map by a cartographer from the 16th century who lived in Antwerpen, you know, in today modern day Belgium. And he was actually is credited with, you know, the father of cartographers. He used to publish very beautiful atlases and so on. And he puts, if you look at the part of in yellow, I don't know if you can see it very, very clearly. You can see there that it says Tartary or Tartaria, which is the land supposedly of the Mongols or the Tartars. But next to it, yes, next to it, to its right, at the center of that, there is a place called Arzareth. And he writes there, this is the place for where the 10 tribes were exiled to. Okay. Now,
Wow.
this is a serious geographer. This is a serious geographer and a cartographer. When I started writing the book, what I did is I did a very simple trick. I said, okay, you know, if Ezra says that they were moved to the east, I should look at all of the early modern maps and look at what is the easternmost position on that map. Okay. And then I discovered that there was another map maker before Ortelius, whose name was Sebastian Munster. And he began to write that. He creates a kind of a peninsula in Northern Asia, yes, in Northeast Asia, that doesn't exist. It's not a real place, but he knows that the 10 tribes must be somewhere. So he put them very, very far in the east. Okay? So no one can check.
Wow.
And he says, this is Arzareth. Now, Ortelius, who is a much more serious person, he actually, when he writes the map, he explains everybody where what is every land is. Yes. Mm-hmm. And he says, these are the lost, this is the land of the lost tribes. This is the Arzareth of the lost tribes. And pay attention that you see in the green there, you see the Japanese islands. And right across the straits, this is supposedly America, which you and I will going to talk maybe in a few minutes from now, but when people begin to think about America in that context. But the thing that is important to us now is that Ezra, the second Ezra or the later Ezra that is not part of the Bible, because he wants to try to drive this message of apocalypse and theology and punishment and so on, yes, he creates this entity that is not real, but it's very real to everybody who believes in that. Even for early modern serious scientists, or at least believe that they are serious scientists, and serious geographers such as Munster and Avram Ortelius, you know, who do that. And they follow actually a very, very simple geographical logic. They say, since he took them to the east, the more we advance with our knowledge to the east, we need to keep pushing them more to the east. Yes, because when we discover a territory and we discover that they are not there, we need to assume that
they keep going and going.
They keep going. That's how they're gonna.
Just to keep the lie going.
Yes, that's how. Yeah, that's how they're gonna place them at the end in America. You know, they say, okay, well, they crossed the straits and they came to America.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's crazy. So we understand second. It's really fourth Esdras, the fake Esdras. but
Yes.
my community feels it's the word of God and that Ezra really wrote it. And I've been trying to tell them for years. They're not hearing me, man. They just not hearing me. They feel it's really Ezra, and they try to hide the apocrypha. It's some sort of conspiracy, to hide the truth. What do you say about that?
Okay. So here we are, and I think that everyone who went to and study biblical texts, went into this. When I was a little kid, I used to go with my grandfather to the synagogue. I used to sit down there, and it didn't really matter, if I was particularly religious or not. I believed what was written there. Okay, it makes a lot of sense to me. Now, later, when I started struggling with this, I said, okay, I have two ways to engage this. One way is to understand the message. And another way is to try to understand why this was written. So, to your colleagues, your friends, your congregation, I would say this. You can understand the message the way it speaks to you, to your heart, and to your believing heart, the way you want. I'm not going to judge, what message you want to draw out of this. Yes, people draw out of messages from different books. But at the same time, we need to understand at the time of writing, what was the purpose of the writing? Because the purpose of the writing was maybe a different message than what you believe today to be the message. Because the biblical text is open always to more reinterpretations. Yes. And when something in history happens, we can go back and say, oh, you know why this happened to us now? Because it's actually prophesied there. But what we do is we always match the message with our present. And this is an ongoing process. Perhaps this is why the Bible is such a beautiful and a powerful text, because you can always adapt it to the changing circumstances. But we know that if we look at the circumstances and the time of writing of this text of Second Ezra, yes, that it was not written at the time. If you look at if you analyze the language, if you analyze, we analyze the what is being described there, you can see that there's no way that it was written at the time that the original book of Ezra was written. Okay, now it still delivers a powerful message to people who want to be attached to a very, very powerful story, to a story of uprootedness, to a story of suffering, but also to an ultimate story of redemption. Yes. Why? Because the author of the second book of Ezra, he wanted, and sometimes people who suffer and people who are weak do this, he wanted to come up with a powerful story to comfort the people in Jerusalem at the time. Yes, who were suffering and who were anxious about, being uprooted. They were anxious about, the Romans, etc. And he said to them, you know what? Look, I'm going to tell you a story about those lost tribes. They're fine, they're fine. Ezra took them, put them in a different place where they are living beyond a certain river and they are protected. And basically he tells them, okay, you're going to be fine. And this is something very, very human, because if I tell you now that, like, look at the pandemic, but when we hear that someone was sick with the virus and survived it, it makes us feel a little more secure, a little bit more confident that we will be able to survive it. Okay. So when you live under occupation, when you live under a yoke of another empire, the story provides you a lot of comfort. At the same time, it also gives you a little twist, because, the author there talks about revenge. And people who are powerless, sometimes they want to imagine that God is coming and take revenge of their oppressors. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that's a very, very powerful message. So I accept the message as people want to cherish it. But at the same time, I want to put it in this certain historical context and say, okay, this is why it was written at the time. Okay.
Yeah, it's like when you had at the Kebar River, you had the priesthood there, and they're like rewriting the whole tradition of the Exodus to give them inspiration to say, hey, look what God did for us in Egypt. He could do the same thing for us in Babylon when we were by the river, of Babylon.
Yeah.
All right. So now we have several different groups. All right. No, no, no. You know what? Let me try to be chronologically about this. So we have Josephus
Yes.
writing about the 12, about the 10 tribes, and
Yeah.
then we have a book called, we have writings, the New Testament, making references. But one thing I gotta say though, to the hardcore folks that believe in this, there's a time when Josiah actually invites Ephraim and Manasseh to some event in Jerusalem. So if technically speaking, the Bible actually answers it for us. If they all the tribes were taken and whatever, you wouldn't have Ephraim and Manasseh accepting or not accepting
Yeah.
Josiah's who was around what, the 7th century BC. So
Yeah.
it wouldn't be accepting his invite if they were quote unquote lost. Just to
Right.
make a simple point. But
Yes.
let's go to Josephus now.
Yeah.
Josephus is saying um there's tribes, but they are at certain, he's not saying they're in where other people are saying. He's saying they are specific to our area, and he's saying what is Josephus saying? He's saying that
Josephus says, yes. Yeah. First of all, to your earlier point, this is important because, in fact, we should remember that most 10 tribes stayed on the land. So when Josiah says, come over, he talks about to the people who remained as subjects of the Assyrian kingdom. He says, come over, I mean, his project is basically to reunite the entire territory because he notices that the Assyrian empire is becoming weak. So he sees this as an opportunity. So a lot is going on with Josiah. We need another whole hour just on Josiah. We leave him alone. But go back to Josephus. Josephus writes a narrative that he also wants to basically fill in the gaps of everything that is not in the Bible. That's how, among many other things that he does, he basically think, okay, this is what I need to do. So he says, yes, there are many, many people across the river. That's what he says. Now, he probably means across the Euphrates, because this is what the Bible tells us. But he keeps it vague so that we don't have a relocation, because by his time, people know. It is debated also in the Mishnah, and some sages of the Talmud are already debating, says, where are they? Yes. And why are they not coming back? And some rabbis even say they will never come back. Okay. So Josephus, who is writing to a certain audience, he says, okay, you know what, you read our Bible and you have all sorts of questions because the Bible is not exactly a seamless narrative. It leaves a lot of questions, it leaves a lot of holes, yes, there. And he says, okay, well, let me tell you, they are somewhere across the river, and they are, and the way in which he uses the river in this context is to kind of define a boundary between us and them. In other words, they are across the river, but this is a sort of a river that doesn't really allow them to cross and come to here. So at the same time that he speaks about it with great confidence, that he's sure knows for sure that they are there, at the same time he says they are across the river. In other words, they are somewhat removed from where we are. And Ezra is also doing, the second Ezra also places them across the river. And this is also the beginning of the tale of a river that, is so hard to cross. And this is maybe why they are not coming back. And again, it solves you another problem. If you had a problem of why they're not coming back, well, not only that they are far away, not only that they are across a river, this is such a prickly river that it doesn't let them come here.
I think you need to elaborate on that, because the river, ladies and gentlemen, is raining rocks.
Yes.
It's a river, Sabbatian or Sabbatican River, raining rocks, and only stops raining on the Sabbath day. So they can't cross, because on the Sabbath they can't do any form of movement. So it's all mythical stuff that sounds, so this is what I'm trying to figure out. Yeah. African Americans, I can't speak for the people in Afghanistan, Japan, China. I can't speak for none of them. What I know for the African Americans, they think, like there's a guy in the audience now commenting, he's saying, I'm from Ephraim. I'm from the tribe of Ephraim. And all of this is because of this lost tribes belief that is people are holding on to. If it inspires them to live a better life, fine. But to condemn other people, you're not going to get the blessings because you don't believe what I believe. That's when I step in and just give them the facts.
That is true, because look, if there is divine blessing, I think all humans are entitled to enjoy it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the one mistake that we always make is that some are blessed and some are not. But here's the other thing, you know, when a story is too perfect, then you need to suspect it. So get this: we place the lost tribes beyond the river, and then we say, okay, well, why don't take a boat, cross the river? No, you can't cross the river because you have all the rocks. Okay. And then you can see how the author really works with you. So like it's like a cat and a mouse. You try to come from here, he's going to close this loophole immediately. So he says, okay, well, you know what? Actually, the river is such an observant river. Okay. It's stormy the entire week. And on the Sabbath, it rests, because everything rests on the Sabbath. But also the lost tribes are resting on the Sabbath because they're observant. They cannot cross it. Okay. And on Sunday, it starts all over again. Okay. So you can never escape this like closed circuit, of a story. And the story is too perfect. Okay. You cannot really escape the way that's why we need to suspect that this is actually true. This suspected the truthfulness of that, because it is too perfect. In a way, if it had a mistake in it, something doesn't work, would be better.
Right. And your book is talks about the lost tribes of world history. We're dealing with geography for a minute. I know Josephus had said that the river was someplace, and I think someone else, was it Philo or Pliny or somebody said it was somewhere else. Can you talk about the river and the locations?
Yeah. So Pliny says, Pliny places this river in Judea, and he doesn't care about the 10 tribes. For him, he says, in Judea, there's a river that rests for 7 days, that works for 7 days, 6 days, and then rests on the seventh, or the vice versa. And Josephus takes that and gives you a different interpretation of the same thing, and then in Philo too. Apparently, this is what my hunch, that the story about the river at the time when it was created was not attached to the story of the lost tribes. It basically was an independent tale. Okay, and it probably had to do with the fact that the Romans, who had no concept of a week, and certainly not a concept of a day of rest, the Romans were fascinated or obsessed with the fact that the Jews have a day of rest. So they came up with the story of a mythical river that rests on the Sabbath. Okay. Now, at some point, I think Jewish authors picked up on the tale of the river and said, that's a perfect solution for us to explain why the lost tribes are not coming. When Josephus says they are across the river, they are across that river. Okay. So what they do is they fuse in two unrelated tales into one. Yes. And now it works beautifully. Okay. And then they give the name, Sambation. In other words, the river that, works for 6 days and then rest on the Sabbath. Wow. Okay. Now, later, what? Yeah. Now, later people say, okay, when the Bible says that the king of Assyria put them across the river Gozan, okay, so you don't know where Gozan is. So when you look at the missionaries, they're going with the British Empire towards India. First, everybody thinks that it's across the Euphrates. Later on, when they get to Afghanistan, they say, well, maybe it's the river Oxus. When they get to India, they say, oh, it's the river Ganges. Yes. In other words, every river that you're going to find as you move east, that's going to be the river. And and when you have missionaries get to Peru, there's a river there. They say, oh, that's the river. Yes. Because when you create such a tale, it has nothing to do with actual geography. You can move it around. What's the problem?
It could be, you can make up as you go. All right. So we're dealing with the Josephus and Pliny. The rabbis now are debating. So the rabbis saying, a couple of rabbis saying, hey, they ain't coming back. There's no lost tribes coming back. So there's other people now, rabbis arguing, you know what? These lost tribes are going to come back. And I think this is probably the root, in my opinion. I'm not a professional.
Yes.
The rabbi that said that they were coming back, if he never said that, maybe it would have closed off a lot of the lost tribe movements.
Yes.
As far
Yeah,
as
I agree.
Yeah, because the rabbi that said yes, they're lost. Oh man, he messed up. He messed us up, man, in the whole history. But go ahead, elaborate on that.
Yeah. So first of all, we need to focus on the fact that there is a debate.
Mm-hmm.
If they are debating, some people say they are coming back or not. First of all, we need to know that is this proof that this was a question on people's minds. Otherwise, they wouldn't be debating it. The second thing is, you see a certain minority that basically says, okay, we need to give up on these people. They're never coming back. This is Rabbi Akiva. He said they're not coming back. But the sages who insist that they are coming back, they do two things. They say we cannot give up the hope that they will, because the hope that they will come back is something real for us in our present right now. Okay? So if you're going to tell us that they are never coming back, not only that you will be discrediting the prophecies of Isaiah, who said that everybody will come back to Jerusalem, all the peoples will come back to Jerusalem, and you can't do that. The second thing that you do is even worse. We need the hope, we need the hope of, keep the hope of redemption alive. If you say that the lost tribes are not coming back, tomorrow you will be saying, that we will never get our sovereignty back. We will never get them. We will never get to come back to Jerusalem. That the yoke of the Romans will never be removed. Yes, and they understand that. That is why they insist. 700 years after the deportation of the lost tribes, 700 years after we know that they are not coming back, or we didn't see them come back, they say you got to keep hope alive. Okay, just think about it when you are like in prison somewhere. Okay, what's more important? The idea that you will one day be set free. Yes, you're not going to give it up. You'll never say, I'm never going to be free. Yes. Mm-hmm. So some people cling to that because it keeps that hope. And one of the things that is very, very clear, that hope sustains the Jews or sustains the oppressed in their present. Because if you say, oh, they're never coming back, you basically are saying we are going to give up hope. And that's the thing you don't want to lose. They don't really care, I think, about the lost tribes. They care about the hope that the lost tribe produce. That's right. Why you need to keep them alive. And that's why, exactly as you said, the person who said that they're not coming back, he messed it up for everybody because he forced the other to insist that they are.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
He was a very, very determined person, Rabbi Akiva.
Rabbi
yes.
Akiva, yes. Yeah. So now we have the debate.
Yes.
And this is like, and by the way, ladies and gentlemen, you're talking about a debate. You're talking from Rabbi Hanasi time period, which is 200 AD, all the way up to like 600 AD. Yeah. Now we're in the Arabic period now. Yes. Where do we look at from like the 7th century to like well, you know what? The next person we would talk about then would probably be Eldad the Danite.
Yes.
Yes. He now comes out.
Yeah.
And he throws a whole monkey wrench in the game because now he's saying, I'm from one of the tribes, and he got 4 other tribes, maybe in Africa, North Africa, or Ethiopia. And he's making this claim, people are feeding him food to make him fat because they wanted to eat him. Yeah. And you talk about how he says he's a Danite, and people don't get this. He's Eldad the Danite because he wants to connect to somebody strong like Samson. So he calls himself the Danite and shows how powerful he is by the grace of God. And he defeats these men who were trying to feed him, and they were cannibals. They ate his compatriot. And the story is just so fascinating. And people are saying this is true. We're not saying Eldad the Danite never existed. Nobody's saying that. We're just saying the story is just maybe just fantastic foolishness. That's pretty much what I'm saying. Go ahead, Dr. Benite.
Yeah. So first of all, we need to understand what did the Arabs do. Okay, just before the rise of the Arabs, you have the crystallization of a lot of legends into one place. Because we need to remember that it's not only that the lost tribes are somewhere on earth. Gog and Magog are also somewhere there, and people are afraid when they're going to show up. So quite nicely, in the wake of all of this amalgamation and confusion of Greek traditions, Roman traditions, Jewish traditions, they come up with a perfect solution. They say, well, Alexander the Great, when he was conquering Asia, he went all the way to the border between China and between India and China. He created a big wall and threw all the people that might be problematic for us beyond that wall. That's why they're never coming back. You wonder about Gog and Magog? Beyond the wall. You wonder about 10 tribes that beyond the wall about that Alexander the Great created. Now, the Arabs unite this world geographically for the first time after centuries that it was never united, because they create an empire that stretches all the way from Spain in the west and northern Africa, Morocco in the west, all the way to the borders of China. So suddenly this entire geography is united, and you can imagine yourself traveling it within it, okay? And here is how, the story of Eldad, comes up. And here's what we know for real. And then we talk about what we don't know for not for real, which is more interesting, okay? What we know for real is that the Jewish community of Qayrawan in Tunisia in the 10th century, they wrote a letter to one of the rabbis in Babylonia, and they said, well, we need to ask you a question. A strange man showed up. He said he's from the tribe of Dan. He said that he was traveling with a merchant from the tribe of Shimon, yes, and they were caught by some cannibals, and they started to, and the person from his other friend from another tribe, was already being cooked, and he managed to escape. And you were right, that he picked up, he tried to make himself like a sort of a Samson kind of a person. But also he picks up on the tribe of Dan, because Dan in the Bible, we know that they were traveling a lot. So he tried to explain that. And if you look at the geography that he's describing, this is very much it's Arab geography in terms of the knowledge of the Arabs, what the Arabs knew about the world at the time. So for example, he talks about the fact that he was in Spain, traveled as far as Spain and traveled as far as like to the borders of China and so on. So it's a kind of traveling within a real known world, but he's really changes the story, okay? Now, there are a lot of debates about who this man was. We can be sure of one thing, that, he was making things up, okay? But once we're sure about whether he was making things up, we can begin to dig into, what he was making up, and then we learn a lot, okay? So I still don't know. No one really knows what he was trying to get out of the people that he told them that story. Maybe he needed some attention, okay? But for them, this resonated a great deal, because they were concerned with where are the 10 tribes. They were concerned, and then suddenly shows up and says, like, I escaped and I showed up here. For them, it's proof that the legend and the tale is true. And for them, this is also proof that they need to keep the hope of the unity, one day of the restoration of the unity of the people. They need to keep the hope alive. Because if the 10 tribes exist, yes, that means that we exist. And it means that one day they will come back and will be all reunited in one people. And that matters more than the veracity or how truthfulness and that makes the story. Yes, he's a very, very creative mind. When I was writing about him, I got into debates because I think, following other people, that he was coming from Yemen, and he was basically replicating some Yemeni stories. Yes, the Yemenis, they were fighting a lot with the Ethiopians. Okay, so I think that a lot of the stories that he tells basically are replicated stories that the Yemenis were telling about the so-called Hamitic people across the Aden Straits, so he has all those fantasies about them, and then he places them himself within the fantasies. Okay, this is debated. Not everybody agrees with me. More than that, more important than that, he's very well versed with the Jewish tales about the river, with the Jewish myth about the lost tribes as it exists in his time, and he uses this as part of the story to increase his authenticity as a 10-triber. And when he does that, they have no choice but to accept his story. Because if they don't accept his story, they basically say, you know what, we actually don't believe, you know, in a major portion of our Bible. Okay? So, and the rabbi in Babylon, he says, yes, we have evidence that they in the tribe of Dan is indeed, you know, in the south, somewhere in Africa, you know, in an area where this man claims to be coming from. Okay? And this is very, very important. And in my opinion, he has no choice but to accept that. Because if he doesn't accept that, he says, oh, this is just an imposter. Yes? He basically says, you ought to give up hope, because if this prophecy is wrong, then a lot of other prophecies are wrong as well. Okay? Now, the other fascinating thing about that is that Eldad describes the development of his religion, yes, which is very similar to the religion of the Jews at the time. And for them, this is proof that, you know, even though the 10 tribes are completely removed, and exist in another land, the evolution of their theology and their religion is similar and parallel to the evolution in the religion of the Jews in the real world, yes, in the revealed world. In other words, God performs the same miracle at the same time. Just as you have the Mishnah and the Talmud and the rabbis, which did not exist in the biblical times, yes, they developed that the same as well, because this is part of the miracle. Now, this is very important for Christianity, because when Christians will start obsessing about the lost tribes, they will say, just as Jesus was revealed to the Jews, yes, the lost tribes became Christian as well, because just as the Jews became Christian, you know, the lost tribes became Christian as well. And they say to themselves, if we find the lost tribes and we'll discover that they became Christian across the river or across where they are, this will be proof that the development of the covenant is the way we tell it. In other words, from Abraham to Moses to David to Jesus. Yes? And it's a very, very different narrative than the narrative that the Jews who refuse to accept Jesus or refuse to accept Christ telling. So there is a little bit of a competition there. You know, if you're a Jew, you should believe that, of course, the lost tribes have developed, their religion developed the way the Jewish religion developed. But if you're a Christian, you would insist that even though they were not present in Jerusalem at the time of Christ, they somehow became Christian, because God watches his nation wherever they are, and he can see all of them at the same time.
Yeah. So we are at Eldad the Danite. Was there an issue with him as far as
I'm waiting for Angelo.
No, sorry. Sorry, someone, yeah.
Yeah.
Please.
Was there an issue with how his form of Judaism was different than the rabbinical Judaism? Was there some controversy about that?
Yes. This is something that it's too much of a detail to get into it. I was trying to avoid it, but you called on me. I'm going to explain it to the best of my abilities.
All right.
In the 10th century, between the 8th and the 10th century, there are all sorts of issues in Babylonian Jewry, but in particular, about, in fact, the development of the Jewish religion. And we have a man, the way it works is that basically after the end of the biblical era, there's a new, the class of the priests declines. You know, the priests were performing the Jewish rituals. They decline, they lose their power, okay, because there's no temple anymore. And we have a new leadership, a new religious leadership, which are replacing the priests, and these are the rabbis, okay? And the rabbis, you know, their main job is to develop the law. In other words, to develop Jewish law. And we have two competing narratives about that. Again, you know, Christianity says Jewish law was abolished and transformed with Christianity. The rabbi said Jewish law was not abolished, but it continues with us, you know, with what we call oral law. In other words, it has to develop, you know, through our deliberations, not just from the giving of the Torah to Moses in Sinai. You know, in fact, when God gave the Torah to Moses in Sinai, he basically also gave him the concept of oral law, which we need to keep developing orally. Around the 9th century, you have competing political and social debates in Babylonia. And there's a man whose name is Anan ben David, and there were others. And he says, no, you know, the law is just the Bible. What you call oral law is something that you have invented. We need to stick to the word of God as it is written only in the Bible. Okay, there are some parallelisms about similar debates that going on with the development of Islamic law at the time. We cannot go into it too much, but this is a political and a theological debate at the same time about who's going to lead the Jewish people. And the followers of this movement are called Karaites. Yes, in other words, they follow the written text, or the text that we read. They follow only the biblical law and the Torah, which that's what they do. Now, remember that I said 5 minutes ago that what was very interesting for these people in Kairawan who ran into Eldad, that the whole thing was that he said, yeah, we have oral law. They asked him, they were curious about him. They said, oh, wow, do you do this? Do you do this? They wanted to compare if his religion is similar to theirs. Yes, maybe they were a little suspicious. And then they asked him a crucial question. They said, do you have oral law? And he said, yes. Now, imagine that now you're the rabbi in Babylon, busy with the fight with all of these factions of people who says the oral law doesn't exist. And then Sunday shows up a letter from people who says, oh, we have someone here from the 10 tribes. And he says we have oral law. Okay. For you, that's going to be proof that your way of understanding the development of the covenant, the development of the covenant with God, is the right way. Why? Because if the lost tribes who are removed from our geography and removed from our history, if their religion developed the same way we did, it validates ours, because God performs this miracle of giving them that. Okay. So again, this is here now, he has another incentive to say, yes, of course he's from the lost tribes. He's not an imposter, precisely because he says that they have oral law like ours. And it validates him in his political debates against, the people who are trying to challenge the authority of the rabbis in Babylon at the same time.
Okay. Wow. I got to rewind that and listen to that later. That was very interesting. You just helped me out a lot. All right. Because I know the whole thing with the Karaites, they broke off from the Babylonian Jews and did their own thing. And, that's a whole nother conversation. All right. So now we're at Eldad the Danite. You have a Christian version of his writing. You have a Jewish version. Everybody want to put out their own version, but it pulls in together the guy who I call the 16th century Jesus, Prester John. That's what I call him. He's the mystery. He's a mystery guy, but the only difference is I believe Jesus is historical and Prester John is looked on as a mythical character that was just made up. And not to get into Prester John too much, but pretty much, ladies and gentlemen, Prester John's story was intertwined with Eldad the Danite and put out like around in the 1400s. And again, at this time period, you didn't have before you had a printing press, you had Christian groups who had their own little religious beliefs. You had Jews, the lost tribe elements. You had the rabbis, the people saying, hey, Israel is coming back. We're going to find the 10 lost tribes. You had different factions trying to put out information. So the Christians put out, there's this great guy named Prester John who has a lot of gold. And, I have my own theory too, that if it wasn't for the Prester John story, maybe the Portuguese wouldn't be looking for him and they wouldn't find the Adahu, the Moor, who tell him about West Africans and slavery and all that stuff. But that's a whole nother story. That's my personal theory. But Prester John's story is it's damaging in the sense of the psyche of normal human beings. But with people like believers, Prester John is great, for Christians and even for Jews. So there's two different versions of the stories going out with Prester John and Eldad the Danite. Can you elaborate on that and how it affects the lost tribes?
Yes. let me tell you, first of all, begin with a little anecdote. If you look about, who wrote a big book about the history of the tale of Prester John, you will discover that this is a man by the name of Robert Silverberg. And Robert Silverberg, we know him because he's a great science fiction author. Okay? So I think
hold on. I gotta make a note of that.
Yeah. I mean, let me find the book.
Make a note of that.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah.
So his name is what? Robert Silverberg.
Yes.
Oh man. We have a saying in our community: a pseudo die at their sources. So that would Robert Silverberg, Prester John. Oh man, I gotta make a note.
I mean, I have his other book here. I have the book somewhere here. Like my office is completely.
Wow.
So Robert Silverberg, he wrote about now, and this is a serious history book, I mean, but it's very interesting that the same man who writes about science fiction writes about that.
Wow.
So what's the story of Prester John? With the rise of Islam, okay, a lot of Christian communities in the Middle East were threatened. One of them, we trace the origins of this to a bishop in the city of Jabala in Lebanon, a man named Hugh of Jabala. And he, probably because he wants to comfort his own community, he tells them a story about a mighty Christian general who lives somewhere in the east, yes, whose name is Johannes Presbyter or Prester John, yes, who might one day show up, and why they put him back in the east? Because first of all, it's far away and no one's going to check his story, yes. But the other thing is, if he's far away back in the east, when he will come to rescue them, the Muslims will be in the middle, yeah. So this myth of a Christian power attacking the Muslims from the back is very, very important. Because you feel besieged, and all you want is like the Muslims should be besieged. You want to comfort yourself. You want to have some hope, okay? And that's why, for example, when the Mongols rise in East Asia, in Central Asia, a lot of people believe at the beginning that this is Prester John. Now, because Prester John is supposed to comfort you, Prester John, the imagined Prester John, begins to travel. Every place where you have Christians, in trouble, they're going to say, Prester John is coming and comforting us. So Prester John first begins somewhere in the east, in the imagined east, but slowly, Prester John makes his way to Ethiopia. Okay, and Ethiopia becomes the legendary, not the real Ethiopia, but the imagined Ethiopia becomes the legendary land of Prester John. Now, if you think about that, there's a certain geographical logic there as well. First of all, if you look at Ethiopia, you will see that this is one Christian land that is surrounded by Muslim lands. Okay, and then people know something about that. They've never been there. They know a lot of things. It's very, very vague. It's one of the earliest Christian countries. It is deep, in Africa, across the Aden Straits, and they have been resisting or fighting with nations that have been Muslims, for centuries, and they are surviving. So to the imaginary mind in the Middle Ages, and later on, even in the early modern period, there can be only one explanation: Prester John. Now, that's why they end up in Ethiopia. The second thing that is going on is, you need to have a Jewish parallel for Prester John, because the Jews are looking at that and say, okay, you invented your own mighty army that one day will come to save you. Well, we have one too, okay? And that's the lost tribes. And this is the moment that because of the interaction with the tale of Prester John, the lost tribes become militarized. And in the later Middle Ages, they begin to imagine them more and more and more as a militarized people, and it exactly that become kind of a mirror opposite of what you are. You are under siege and you're weak and you don't have an army and you suffer. Okay, so they are tall and they are strong and they have a big army and they're going to come and one day they're going to save you. And this makes you feel good. Just as it makes feel good, the Christians of that city of Jabala, to imagine that there is like a great, someone's one day is going to come to save them. It's the same thing. And at some point, the stories become enmeshed together, and you can't really decipher who is who, okay? And people begin to situate the the land of the lost tribes together with the land of Prester John. For example, you know, there was someone in England in the Middle Ages by the name of John of Mandeville. And he faked a whole travelogue that he traveled into different locations. And there's one place in his narrative that he never really went. I don't think he ever left England. But there's one place in his narrative, he says, yeah, I went to the land of Prester John, and he has a huge army, and the lost tribes are next to him. Why not?
Yo, I can't. Yo, I can't. Wow. This is amazing. You don't know. Wow. Hey, Robert, what's his name? Robert Silverman?
Robert Silverberg. Yes, I used to love him as a kid, you know, as a science fiction person. And I don't, you know, I mean, it's very, very interesting that he writes about that. Because if you think about it, if you think about it, this is a version of science fiction. Okay. Today, you know, we watch Star Trek, we watch all of that stuff. People are traveling in space, running into alien races and alien species. And, you know, some of them are good, some of them are bad. But somehow they always mirror, you know, ourselves as humans. You know, either they are complete opposite or they are the same. And the story basically always validates, you know, who we are right now.
Right, right.
And in the Middle Ages, this was a form of science fiction.
This is funny. It's amazing, but hey, people, I hope this show helps a lot of people. That's all I gotta say. But so now we're at the Prester John. We're at the people trying to say, hey, this exists, so forth. Literature is surrounding, because John Mandeville was very circulated, and all right. So we're in the period of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yes.
All right. So we have Africans being brought here. We have we have Europeans coming into the Americas, South America and so forth, and they're finding people, and everywhere they go, they're telling people, hey, you the lost tribes are, let's talk about, we talked about this before we went live. It was a form of colonization, but they did it the gentler way. So let's talk about what the Roman Catholics did and what the Protestants did.
Yes. Okay. So if we follow the logic that basically every new land that you go, if everybody's like asking where are the lost tribes, the logic says that every time they're going to find a new land, you know, the first question that they're going to ask, well, maybe the people who live here are the lost tribes. Yes. The second issue here, if you believe in the Bible, then all the people on earth have to be represented in the Bible. They have to mention as a peoplehood or as a nationhood in the Bible. What do you do when you find a continent that is not mentioned in the Bible and they have a people that are not mentioned in the Bible? Because if you say, oh, you know, well, the Bible doesn't speak about America, then you have a serious problem with the authenticity of the Bible, and you're going to have a problem with your faith. So you need to find a way to bring America into the Bible and to bring the people in America into the Bible as well. Otherwise, you have a major theological problem, okay? Because the assumption is that, you know, the Bible accounts for all the people on earth. So when they discover the Americas, you know, not the first question, but one of the earliest questions that they ask when they encounter humans in America, who are these people? And there are many, many theories, but the theory that becomes the most persistent is so-called, you know, the Jewish Indian theory. This is how they call it in the time, or, you know, basically the theory that the Native Americans are in fact the 10 tribes. Now, and then you can see why the story is very, very useful. And I will explain that, how people twist the story in different way. First of all, it is useful because it reconciles the biblical story with the discovery of America. You say, well, no problem. You know, we learned that, you know, God threw them into another land. America is the other land. Problem solved geographically. You have these people here that you don't know who they are. Well, we know who they are. You know, they are the descendants of the lost tribes. That's the basics, okay? We should remember, by the way, that the first 3 decades after the discovery of America, in Christian Europe, there was a debate whether the people there are in fact humans or not. And Pope Leo X declared that they are humans. Now, the moment you declare that they are humans, you need to basically now find out, you know, what's the story with them, and also you need to find out how you're going to convert them to Christianity. And here you can see the twist of the story. Now, not everybody is telling that story, but some people are telling this story so it can suit their own, what they're doing. So one of the things that we see rising in Spain is the argument that the lost tribes, that the Native Americans that they encountered in the southern parts of the American continent are the lost tribes, because they have debates in Spain about what they are doing to these people, which is, massacres and wars, and a lot of suffering and genocide and dispossession. So, and it's not that all the Spaniards accept that. Some of them, like Bartolomeo de las Casas, he chastised the Spaniards. He says, like, you are creating a human disaster here, okay? And the story that these people are the lost tribes now serves you something very interesting. Not only it reconciles the biblical geography and biblical humanity, it also provides a useful explanation as to what is happening to the Native Americans. And what is that? Look, God said he was going to punish them. We are only doing, the word of God. This is part of the prophecy of the punishment. And some people find it very, very comforting, okay? We're going to go back to another twist of this story in a minute. But let's go look at Northern America. In Northern America, you have two things going on at the same time. You have, first of all, part of the Atlantic slave trade, and the activities there. You have a lot of issues, with what is going on that, particularly in the Caribbean. And we can talk about Afro-Caribbean religions and Afro-Caribbean traditions. So the Caribbeans really preserve a lot of African traditions. Yes, they are not completely erased, and they later on move into the Americas. So that's one story. The second story is that in the Northern American interpretation of the Jewish Indian theory, so quote unquote, or the theory that the Native Americans are the lost tribes, it helps them in two ways. First of all, it turns America into a sort of a biblical land, a part of the Bible. Second, when you go to convert the Native Americans, yes, after you yourself escaped religious persecution in England, yeah, you're not going to do that. Instead, what you're doing is that you are actually restoring them to their original religion. Because if they are lost tribes and they are Israelites, their original religion was Judaism, yes, or Israelism as Christianity understand it. And therefore, what you're doing is you're not coming in and erasing people's culture. You restore their culture to its original state. That's a very, very nice and convenient story to understand, how you convert people. And you can say, I'm not converting them. I'm actually restoring them to the way they were before because their religion somehow got corrupted. And if you look at, the story of the Americans, at that point, you see a lot of obsessions trying to prove that the Native Americans are in fact Jews. So you have people, like you mentioned, James Adair, he comes in and he invests a lot of money in studies and a lot of things, basically trying to prove that, some Native American languages, in fact, are distorted forms of Hebrew. And some Native American practices are, in fact, ancient Hebrew or Israelite practices. Okay. At the same time, there is a very serious Christian anxiety about the fact that, the Native Americans, maybe they don't want to reveal themselves, that they hide their identity. And you see these cries in different places, please reveal yourselves to us, because this is part of a redemptive story, okay? It's a part of a great unity between people who escaped religious persecution in England, came to find freedom in the Americas, and now they're going to be united with the original natives, together. And the persistent, stubborn Native Americans just refuse to do that. You study them and you study them and you study them and you study them, and they just resist becoming the lost tribes. Yes, some of them were. For example, William Penn, he was so annoyed with this whole obsession with some people that I think one of his friends, he said to him, "Don't talk to me about the lost tribes anymore. I'm really, really tired of that." some Native Americans, in fact, did acquire a lost tribe identity and did say, you know, we are from the lost tribes. You know, because of that dialogue, it produced a new version of it for their side. But the most interesting development about that is, in fact, the rise of Mormonism. Because just before the rise of Mormonism, you have yet another book that comes out, which is called A Call for the Hebrews. Okay, and who are the Hebrews who are being called? Yes, the Hebrews who are being called are the lost tribes, you know, are the Native Americans who are supposedly the lost tribes. You know, we call on you. And let us not forget that the mission of Christianity, particularly in its Protestant form, is to bring the message. So you need to reveal them as lost tribes to give them the message, okay? And somehow, you know, the Native Americans still insist on not revealing themselves as the lost tribes. But then Joseph Smith solves the problem for us. Because if science, like linguistics, sort of ethnography of all the rituals, if science doesn't prove that these are the lost tribes, why don't we do what we always do? Come up with a revelation, okay? So he says, forget about all of these scientific attempts to prove that they are the lost tribes. Let me come back and let me tell you the true story. The true story is that the Americas, you know, had sacred tablets, you know, that were transferred here at the time, you know, of the lost tribes' exile, okay? You know, and they came here and they brought the tablet, they brought the sacred tablets, and, you know, by the way, I have them in my possession, okay? Now, this is a very, very powerful story. You don't have to believe in that, but you have to believe in the power of it because it solves you immediately a number of problems. First of all, it solves the mystery about whether or not the Native Americans are the lost tribes. Second, if you're a religious person and you live in a continent that is not mentioned in the Bible, you want to make it part of the Bible. The moment that Joseph Smith says that the revelation, part of the God's revelation came here with the Latter-day Saints, he turns the place into a sacred holy land immediately, okay? And that is very, very important if you are to become a Mormon, okay? And when I was doing the studies, I found, you know, there was a very prickly rationalist person who really didn't want to believe any nonsense. So he had a journal, you know, for rationalist people. His name was Raffinesque. And Raffinesque writes in his, in the early 1820s, he says, well, you know, these people are obsessed with the lost tribes all the time. Now I hear about some guy from England, from Dublin, you know, Long Kingsborough, who spent all his fortunes trying to prove that the Native Americans in Mexico are the lost tribes. He studied their art in order to find some Hebrew traces in the art, lost all his fortunes trying to do that, and now he died in the debtors' prison in Dublin. And he ends the story there, and he says, just as this guy is dead, we now hear about another group of people, you know, following Joseph Smith, you know, who now claim that they have the solution, they discovered the lost tribes, etc., etc., etc. And by the way, he said he of course hates these people who would become later on the Mormons, and he says, look, he says they even have this Quran that they move in with. Now, he says they are following this man with their Al-Quran, okay? Now, he mentions the Islamic scripture, okay? Now, it's not, at the time when I was writing it, I made a mistake. I thought it was a derogatory term because, you know, maybe he hated Muslims, so he basically said that the Book of Mormon is in fact a Quranic, is a text like the Quran. But he didn't mean that. It's a very good opportunity for me now to admit my mistakes. I don't think that he meant that. What he meant is that just as the Quran is a post-New Testament revelation, it's a form of a post-New Testament revelation, yes, that you can accept or reject. The revelation of Joseph Smith is like the Quran. It's something that comes out of after the New Testament. In other words, it's a form of scripture, revelatory scripture, in which the God reveals his word to a group of people, and it is the same status of the Quran in the sense that both come after the New Testament. And if you see this way, you can see that we have a certain hierarchy, because if you're a Jew, yes, you say, okay, you have the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and that's when Revelation ends. Everything else is interpretation. But if you're a Christian, you say, well, you have the Hebrew Bible, but now we call it the Old Testament, and then we have a New Testament, a new covenant. Yes. If you're a Muslim, you say, well, we have the Hebrew Bible, it's valid but been distorted. You have the New Testament, it's valid but been distorted. And then you have the Quran, which is the true word of God. And then you move on to another form of revelation, another form of scripture, which is Mormon scripture, yes, and say, okay, this is the fourth revealed word of God that is there. So in many ways, it solves all sorts of problems that people have in the Americas, you know, the theological problems that he basically says that. And then the question is, again, do we believe the story or do we accept the message? Fact of the matter is that people said, you know, they accepted the message. And Mormonism is one of the most dynamic religions. You know, it's now not just about the lost tribes, it's about a lot of many other things. But Mormonism it basically is about, okay, you know, we don't going to do all of that. We're going to just accept the message. Except that if you read the later history of the Mormonism, you see that a lot of Mormons spend a lot of time trying to calculate how the Native American, how the lost tribes, you know, came to the Americas. And one of the things that I discovered that there's a lot of literature about the North Pole, because supposedly, if they did not cross the Atlantic, they probably came from the North Pole. Okay, and there are many tales about that. You know, there was a very important Mormon messenger whose name was Oliver Pratt. Yes. And since Mitt Romney is from the Pratt-Romney family, I suspect, you know, he's related to this man. And Oliver Pratt actually calculated how, you know, in terms of the distances that, you know, there will be, they crossed the North Pole when they came to the Americas. And again, this fits the stories because, you know, if you think about it, Ezra says that they traveled east. Okay, they traveled east until they hit the Bering Straits, crossed the Alaskas, you know, and came to the Americas. So the story works very well in that. Okay. Fact of the matter is that at the end of the day, the Indian Jewish theory or the Native American, the theory that the Native Americans are the lost tribes gave way because, you know, people got tired of it. You had two choices. Either you embrace the new religion or you just stop with this obsession and accept the Native Americans as who they are, yeah? But then the story begins to rotate in many other ways because it still remains powerful for other groups to embrace it.
Wow. All right. You might have to take an hour for this question, but
Yeah.
what about the Africans in West Africa mainly and the Hebrew traditions and so forth? Because a lot of the things that we find is like, oh, circumcision, they did circumcision, and they always forget that the women are circumcised too in Africa. For some reason, they just skip that part over. But what do you say about the Africans before we get to some more stuff about you touched on James Adair.
Yeah.
And if you ever come back on my channel, I would love for you to do a part 2. I would love for you to go into the Native American part, because what the African Americans are doing is they're saying that the Native Americans some of them are the lost tribes and are our brothers. And they are our brothers, and they use James Adair and the whole Hebrew. I would love for you to bring some slides and show, you know, because they have these groups out here, man. They pull this in. So I want people to use this as a reference so that they could go back and do their own research or actually get your book, The Lost Tribes, A World History. All right. But talk about African Americans and
let's talk about, you know, the African connection.
Right.
So, I mean, it's very crucial to understand that you know, recognizing a certain religion is a tricky thing, you know, because I can travel in different places and I can see people doing something that I'm doing. And it's not exactly the same thing, but then, you know, I might identify them as people who basically share my religion with me. But that means that I have a concept of religion that is that is somehow, part of, somehow migrated and was accepted as the entire package. Or I should be a little bit more humble and say that if I travel to different places in the world and I discover people who have similar practices to mine, it's probably because, there's a shared understanding, of the importance of these practices, and that has nothing to do with any religious encounter that happened, or that both religions, mine and the religion that I encounter, originate from a set of practices, that existed before that and was feeding into different communities, and different communities adopted parts of it, okay? Why this is important? Because when we discover African communities, yes, and we have testimonies, for example, like Olaudah Equiano and others, when we discover African communities in Nigeria today and elsewhere who have practices that we can identify, I wouldn't call them Jewish, I would call them biblical, practices that we identify as biblical. For example, circumcision, yes, of males, or washing your hands ritualistically, or, particular, Equiano talks about it a lot, the question of, cleanliness and purity, yes, of the whole idea of hygiene is actually a matter of holiness, not a matter of health, yes. We can be tempted to say, oh, they are Jews. But when you say that, you're basically reducing the other to yourself. How about doing it in a different way? Say, perhaps what happened is that the practice of circumcision was widespread in the territory between Africa, in the African territories, and then, it became part of, because people were wandering, people were traveling across deserts and so on, so they brought it with them, into other areas. And then, new religions that were formed in these areas adopted that ritual and adopted that practice. So what I'm saying is that, in fact, there is a possibility that the practice of the circumcision actually originates in Africa, and it is the Israelites who adopted it, not the other way around, yes? Or that both groups share the practice of circumcision, regardless of, what exactly religious explanation they gave to it, and that explains for the similarity. For example, we have archaeological sites, archaeological finds in Egypt that shows that, you have arks, okay? The Bible tells us there was an Ark of the Covenant. But what happens when you find the arks? They're not Ark of a Covenant, but you find arks in Egypt, in archaeological site. Does it make the Egyptians Jews? It doesn't make them Jews. It basically makes them people who believed that, maybe when you go to war, you take your God with you on an ark, as part of your war effort, okay, is for motivation and so on. Remember that the Bible describes the Israelites taking the ark to war, okay? Taking the ark to war in order to help them and to motivate them and so on. To me, it makes a lot of sense. Other people take a trumpet and a flag to war. Why not take an ark, to the war if it motivates the soldiers, okay? And again, this is a practice that's shared by the Egyptians and shared by the Israelites. Does it make the Israelites Egyptians? No. Does it make the Egyptians Israelites? Also no. But it makes both of them, people who probably come from a much greater shared space in which some practices, are common, okay? Which means that I do not personally discredit, findings, of certain African tribes, Lemba, Yoruba, Igbo and the Igbo, I do not discredit, that, this is in fact something that, they practice. I actually accept that. Now, when it comes to in the interpretation, then we need to see, is it really a sign that the original religion of these people was Israelite? I don't think so. Yes. But this is not, the factual question is less important, that, why do people embrace the message? And that brings me, across the Atlantic to why all of these stories are being embraced here. As we say, we don't really have to debate, the fact that people do practice circumcision in Africa, and that makes them part of, some sort of a sphere that is shared also by ancient Israelites. It seems to me and I was talking a lot about that, in earlier forms, it seems to me that what is important here is that the message of the lost tribes is a message of hope. Sometimes it is also a message of revenge, as we've seen with Prester John and the militarized version of the lost tribes. But ultimately, it's a message of hope. It's a message of restoration. It's a message of you being uprooted, taken far away, oppressed, but there is a promise of return. There's a promise of reuniting with your people. There's a promise of a certain restoration of a peaceful past that was once whole. Yes? I can tell you, when I was in fourth grade, you read about the split of the two kingdoms. I felt pain. I thought, what do you mean? Why do you split the two kingdoms? I wasn't particularly religious, but I felt pain, I wanted, my nation to be one. Okay?
Wow.
Now, if you come up with this story, particularly when you are in a situation where you need to, your past, you have been robbed of your past, yes? And you need to restore yourself to a certain past. You need to embrace a story that will give you a sense of identity, but also a sense of purpose, yes? To a certain extent, the story of the 10 tribes is a very, very powerful one. And it also makes a lot of sense because you can play with it, so it will give you the messages that you need, as we have seen in the time that we've been speaking, how it goes in different directions and so on and serves different peoples. Yes.
Yeah. I was thinking about how in Afghanistan, they have a lost tribe story and they connected it to bin Laden. In Japan, they have their story is so thorough, like it's just amazing.
Yeah.
How in China, but in defense of all these folks who claim this, there is traditions of Radhanite Jews or traveling Jews and trading Jews who have sex with women in the culture and so forth, and have babies. So of course, those people are always going to have a tradition of some form of Judaism anyway.
Yes.
So it's not like they just came out the blue and said, hey, I'm the lost tribes out of the blue. There may have been connections with traders and so forth.
Yeah.
Other than trying to convert people, because it's like a converting game with the Native Americans, the people in Peru. And you know what's crazy? I'm looking at some statues, small little statues in Peru, and it shows that the Peru culture had a lot of homosexuality. And I'm like, whenever they try to claim that these people are Israelites, they never bring that out. That part of the Peru culture or the Mayan culture that was homosexually based, they wouldn't bring that out. But they'll find circumcision or try to find some trick words to say, some linguistics gymnastics to say, hey, this word is a Hebrew word, Elaborate on that for me.
Yeah, I don't know anything about those practices, but it's probably, maybe it's ritual sex that is done. We have a lot of evidence that this is something that used to be practiced and so on. I wouldn't call it homosexuality per se. I mean, by the way, if you read the Bible and if you read what Josiah is doing in the temple, it says that Josiah gets rid of the male prostitutes that were in the temple.
Mm-hmm.
If you read in the book of Kings, that suggests that, and then, he destroys all the idols and so on. That suggests that, some people were practicing it even in Jerusalem. It doesn't make everybody, but, in the ancient period, performing sex in all sorts of ways, in front, in a holy place was not necessarily desecrating it. Sometimes it's the other way around, it's part of a ritual. So we can't really understand it exactly as, sex as just a physical temptation of the flesh or something like that. Maybe it has to do all sorts of meanings to that. But with regards to what happens, I think we can establish that the story of the tribes is precisely because they are lost. It travels all over the world. And when it runs into some facts that fit into the story, and people have enough interest into adopting it because it serves their religious or identitarian or political desires, they go ahead and they do it, okay? And this is how they travel to Afghanistan. They travel, for example, In Japan, you know, you have people who believe that they are from the tribe of Zebulun, because the Bible says that the tribe of Zebulun lives by the sea. So they say, okay, we are here, you know. And that comes out of the desire to be included in the Bible story, because Japan is not included in the Bible story. The Bible doesn't say God created the Japanese. Now, if you believe in the Bible and you're Japanese, you want to find yourself in it. So some people, not all of them, you know, they do that. Or, you know, you have all of these images that I find on the internet about the samurai being, you know, in fact, a priestly class, okay, and a warrior class. Okay, we can dismiss that as the facticity of that, but we should not dismiss the fact that people come up with the story because it serves some purpose for them. And you can count also the Incas, yes, and you can count some Incas, you know, adopted the lost tribe identity. The Finns, many European nations, including, of course, you know, the British.
You know what I forgot? And you're bringing it up right now, British Israelism, because one of the sects in the African American group, they've basically taken British Israelism and like colored it. So that's, they're pretty much saying that's them, and that they migrated to America and so forth. Because we know they split it into Ephraim and Manasseh. So those are the two tribes. For those who don't know British Israelism, remember America was colonized by the British, parts of it anyway, until totally overall. But they're saying that the Britain is one tribe and the United States is another tribe. So there are people now within my community are saying, hey, that's them. And they basically, you know, so I don't know if you want to go into that a little bit, British Israelism.
Very, very briefly, okay. So first of all, let's go back to the origins of it. Let us recall that, you know, some of his prophecies, you know, Isaiah says, you know, the people, the tribes are at the islands of the sea, okay? And we don't know what he means by that. Maybe he means the islands in the Mediterranean that are close to the land of Israel, you know, Cyprus and so on. But if you are in a rising empire that happens to be on an island, like the British Islands, you might fall in love with the theory that in fact you are the lost tribes. Now, why would you fall in love with that theory? Because, you know, you want to share the blessing. You want to share the divine blessing that was given to the tribes, but you don't want to be a Jew. So the 10 tribes provide you a very good solution. You can be an Israelite without being a Jew. And the story is that, you know, there was a man, he was a Canadian officer. He was in a mental asylum in the late 18th century in England, you know, and he started writing these prophecies and theories that, in fact, you know, the British are the people of, are the 10 tribes. And he says, my proof is that, you know, Isaiah says that people who are coming from the island of the sea will spread all over the world. And we are fulfilling this prophecy. Look at us, you know, we live on islands. And now we have the Americas, and we have India, and we have here, and we have there, and soon enough we're going to go to Africa. Yes, we are basically fulfilling a wonderful prophecy. Now, this is powerful for a lot of people who believe in the biblical narrative and want to find themselves in it, but they also want to give a meaning to what is happening to them right there. And it doesn't matter that this man lives in a mental asylum. It's enough for us that he sends a powerful message that makes sense to some people, that explains to them what is going on to them, okay? Now, more importantly, it creates the idea that the Anglo-Saxon people or the people of the British Islands are chosen in a way and they are blessed in a way, because remember, Ephraim and Manasseh, they are given the blessing of Jacob, as the Pentateuch tells us, okay? And by the way, you can see very interesting things, because British Israelism rises from both sides of the Atlantic. And first, when England is powerful, they say that England is Manasseh, because Manasseh is, of course, the tribe that is more important, yes? But later, when the United States become more powerful than England, they switch and they say, no, England is Ephraim, and no, England is Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim is the more important, the strongest tribe. And I will send you some references to that. You know, I have all of this literature in my office. I would love actually to give it to someone. Okay, but the point is that, British Israelism provides some people, not all of them, provides some people in England an explanation and also a divine justification for their imperial moves, because they say we are simply fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah. We are the people of coming of the sea and so on. And one of the things that they do, by the way, they reinterpret the word British. Yes, because British means that you're from Britain. But if you break it into two words in Hebrew, it becomes something completely different. Brit-ish. And Brit-ish in Hebrew, yes, means a man of a covenant. Okay, so they say that's the real meaning of the word British. Now, another thing that is going on here, since the story of the lost tribes is a story about wandering, of course we're wandering, of course we're traveling. We just robbed the Armada, we have the amazing Navy, we are all over the place over the sea, we're going to conquer all over the world. Well, of course, it's been prophesied in the Bible, and therefore it is justified by the Bible. Okay. Now, British Israelism became a very, very important myth, that not everybody in England, followed it, but enough people were obsessed with it for it to become a religious and a political movement, okay? But then you have somebody who is going to hijack that and make the story even better. Because British Israelism takes the story of the lost tribes and places it in England and in the Americas. But in England and the Americas, you don't only have, English people or people of English origin. You also have the people whom they enslaved. Yes. And then say, okay, you know what? You have the story about yourself, which is a story about great wandering and so on. We're going to take it from you and we're going to adopt it and we're going to make it about us. Yes. And it's going to be about our greatness. It's going to be about our promise, and it's going to be about our redemption. And again, the facticity of it doesn't matter. What matters here is the power of the message.
Where did this whole thing about King James being an Israelite, where did that originate, if you know?
That I do not know. The one thing that I can say is that King James, one of the reasons that he, initiated this whole process of translating the Bible is because he wanted to win legitimacy. He wasn't really an entirely legitimate king in many eyes because of religious reasons, and, translating the Bible into English, was part of an attempt to become more legitimate in the eyes of the English people. It also one of the earliest moments in which the Bible became accessible to a lot of people who can now read it in their own language. And the Bible is not one story, it's many, many stories. And you can adopt whatever suits you. Okay? You can pick up a story from there and you say, that means that speaks to me. That is something that is powerful to me. Yes. And I'm going to find myself in this story. And in fact, I'm going to reinterpret my own history according to that biblical narrative. The most prevalent example of that, of course, is the example of the story of the Exodus. Because everyone who's been oppressed, would say the Exodus is a story about oppression, enslavement, and final redemption, and also revenge, yes, and deliverance to a promised land. That speaks to me. This gives me hope. So if you read Michael Waltz's theories about, the story of the Exodus and revolution, what is a revolution? Revolution is a moment in history in which you break free. Yes. So a lot of people adopted that and they frame it according to the story of the Exodus. So it makes total sense why people who are exposed to the biblical story in the Americas, yes, would find themselves in a similar condition to the conditions of the Israelites in Egypt and say, okay, if you accept that they were in Egypt, you also accept the hope that one day they will get out of Egypt, they will be redeemed. Okay, it makes a lot of sense for them in that in that context, and it is indeed very, very powerful. Let me give you another example that goes back to the split. Remember, we started talking about the split. Okay. Right. So, for instance, if you look at the American War of Independence, a lot of priests and delivered sermons in the United States at the time, they basically said it is our right to split from England just as it was the right of the 10 tribes to split from the house of David. In other words, it legitimized the move of breaking of the colonies to break from England, because they said, you know what? I mean, sometimes God wants this way, you know, because you become oppressors. The British Empire is an oppressing empire, and we're going to break. And one of the things that you see is that the narrative of the split, yes, which is just part of the story, the narrative of the tearing of the dress, yes, of splitting a kingdom, occurs several times. And if you look at American history, you will find it in the American Revolution, and you also will find it in the American Civil War. Yes, because what you have in the Civil War, you also have a split. Okay. And now, again, different people use this story, the biblical story, to adapt it to their conditions, but also to their own purposes. Because if you are, you know, part of the Confederacy, you're going to say, well, you know, this is exactly, you know, it serves me to have this split because it's a sort of divine or biblical legitimacy to what I'm doing, you know, for my purposes. But if you're in the North, you can interpret it in a different way, etc., etc., etc.
All right. I have a question in the audience. And ladies and gentlemen, we're winding this down. If you have a question, Dr. Benite don't have all day, but the first question from Mr. Richard White: how much is the justification of lost tribe narrative a part of the Western Academy curriculum, if at all?
I wouldn't say, I don't know. I don't know how many people accept it in the academy. I would be surprised. As I said at the beginning, I was less interested in the facticity of the story or in the historicity of it. I was more interested in the way in which it travels and being adopted by cartographers, geographers, and people. I think I counted in the Library of Congress, you know, if you look at, you know, lost tribes and the topic, you have maybe 700 books written over the years. Most of them are not academic. They pretend to be academic. I mean, I wrote an academic book. Recently, there's a book that came out in NYU Press that talks about, you know, the myth and the tale of the lost tribes in America. Yes, but again, it's not about the facticity of the narrative. What makes it an academic is that it discusses how the story here operated in theological and political circles.
Okay. All right. Any more questions? I don't want to hog it and do all the questioning and so forth. So basically, from a historical perspective, you would draw the conclusion that this story is inspirational, and it evolved over the years. I go back to the rabbi. I'm not telling you where. I go back to the rabbi that said, yes, they're going to return. I think he is the point where it gave fellow Jews justification for holding on to that. It probably because of the persecution of Jewish people over the world, it gave them something as far as a new exodus, you know, for lack of a better term, to say, hey, you know what, this happened to me, so you know what, God is going to return me back to the land, or God is going to do something special for me. African Americans, South Americans, North American, natives, Afghanistan people, Chinese people, Indian people, Japan people, European people, the people in Britain, they all took the story based off of the history of the rabbi to Eldad the Danite to Prester John, the evolution of the story. The Christians started adding on to it. They use what we'd call in literature, like in a play, an ad lib. They were ad libbing the whole time and adding on to the story till it evolved. Then you had the guy called Manasseh Ben Israel that came out with the House of Israel, or whatever it's called. And then you had several people who wrote after that. James Adair took it to another level, saying, hey, look, I got the linguistic stuff. So not many people in his day was into linguistics, but the Jews who could speak the language and knew native, they knew it was BS from the jump, but not the regular people, you know, who would just listen to James Adair. So James Adair is what a lot of people are holding on to. They don't have the other side. That's why I said, if you have the time in the future, maybe in April, you could come back and do something just on James Adair and just show the
Yeah.
slides and everything, because we definitely need that in our community.
Yes,
All right.
because one thing about James Adair, whatever he did, whether it is right or wrong, he actually invented the science of linguistics or anthropology, because he basically shows us how, if you want to find out who is the person, how to study their language. He kind of did it. He did it maybe for the wrong purposes, but he did it.
Okay. Are the modern Samaritans likely the descendants of the remaining northern tribes? I will add to that question and say that some of the people that stayed back, would you accept that? Because
Yes.
I mean, the Samaritans was like 350 people a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
They're like, it's not a lot of them.
Yeah.
You know?
In fact, two things about that very, very quickly. Number one, if you look at the archaeology of Jerusalem in the 8th century, you find that sometimes between 720 BCE and the beginning of the 7th century, the population of Jerusalem doubled. In fact, they built a whole new neighborhood. And then you ask yourself, how come, within 2 decades, you have twice as people as you had before? One of the theories is, in fact, many refugees from the north after the Assyrian conquest of Samaria actually moved to Jerusalem. And that that explains a lot of things. For example, it explains why suddenly there is a rise of literacy in Jerusalem. Before that, not a lot of people knew how to read and write, but suddenly a lot of people you have coming in and they know how to read and write, because the Israelites in the north were more prosperous and therefore they had more literate people. Second, it explains why some northern traditions about the tribe of Ephraim, migrated and were incorporated into the corpus of the biblical stories that is being created in Jerusalem in the 7th century. It also explained to us why then suddenly have this idea of once being united people. In fact, maybe they were never a united people, but now you have all of these refugees, they put together the stories together. So if you ask where are the lost tribes, maybe they are very nearby in Jerusalem, most of them. That's number one. Number two, Samaritans. The Samaritans, I didn't know much about them, but recently I saw I heard a podcast with one of the priests, and there are two stories about the Samaritans. The biblical story says that, just as the Assyrians deported the Israelites elsewhere else, they brought other people from elsewhere to Samaria and they settled them there. And these people learned the ways of the Hebrews or the Israelites, and these are the Samaritans. That would be the biblical explanation. But in fact, what the Samaritans do represent is a different form of scriptural tradition, that instead of placing the temple in Jerusalem, it places the temple in Shechem, in Nablus. Okay?
Right.
In other words, these people, are natives of the land just as anybody else, but their narrative is a narrative that basically says, look, we agree with you on everything in the biblical story, with one difference. You say that the temple is in Jerusalem. We say that the temple is in Shechem on the mount, the holy mount of Gerizim. Now, why this is important? We know that there was a temple there. We know that there was more than one temple in the Holy Land. I mean, it's not a unique, every nation has its own temple of own house of worship. Okay. So of course, if you have your own scripture, you're going to claim that, God prescribed to be in that place, so it's not, I don't think that the Samaritans themselves, the existing Samaritans themselves, hold the tradition they were brought by the Assyrians from elsewhere. They would say that they are in fact descendants of the ancient Samaritans, who of course, believed that the temple needs to be in their territory and not in Jerusalem. Because when you read the Bible, you see that there's a lot of obsession that the temple is in Jerusalem all the time. And if you read it this way, you ask yourself, why are they keep insisting that God says that the temple will be in Jerusalem? Maybe because there's somebody else who claims a very, very different claim, and maybe they have to repeat it all the time, precisely because of that. And we have archaeological evidence that some temples elsewhere were destroyed by the kings of Jerusalem. For example, if you go to an area in Israel, in southern Israel called Tel Arad, you will find a temple there. And you will find that sometimes around the period of Hezekiah, during the Hezekiah reform, you will find that he destroyed the temple that existed there because he wanted to concentrate all the worship in Jerusalem as part of the reform that he was doing. Recently, they found, the Bible tells us that, there was a king in Israel called Yehu. And they said that Yehu destroyed a lot of temples of what he considered idolatry. And they say that he turned he turned some of the altars into toilets. Yes, he made a hole and they say, okay, you're going to use this as a toilet. And some archaeological, I will send you the picture of it. Some archaeologists a few years ago found an altar that was converted into a toilet seat, exactly as the Bible describes it. Okay, wow. So now what is the purpose here? It's like if I have a temple and I want to attract people to come and worship there, I'm going to invent a story that says, the temple is exactly here because this is what God wanted it to be. Okay, and if I repeat it many, many times, we need to conclude two things: either that I'm right, or that I'm so concerned that a nearby guy has his own competing temple and he says, I'm the real one. Just think about it, when you travel in New York, and how many places called themselves the Real Ray's Pizza. Like in my area, there are 5. In my area, there are 5. So I'm saying to myself, I came to America, I said the Real Ray's Pizza, that Ray's Pizza, and so on. Then I realized, okay, Ray's Pizza is probably a legendary pizza, the best pizza in the world. So one guy opens the store, says, I'm Ray's Pizza. And then another guy opens the store, says, I'm Ray's Pizza. Okay.
But you know what, though? It goes back to what I said when I'm looking at the Bible, I'm saying who, what, where, why, and how. And what happened is whoever is doing the writing at the last time, their version is the version everybody's using. And that version is a Deuteronomic Judean version. That's why you see, in Genesis 49, Judah is the scepter and he's the best tribe. And everybody wants to be from the tribe of Judah, but it goes back to, they want to be the real Ray's Pizza. And that's what it boils down to. And a lot of people don't realize the temple, people in charge are coming from that perspective. And Judah at the time, remember between when the Seleucid Empire, when the Romans came in and helped them, from that time period, who knows what was added on or what was added to the biblical text or even before that. So, because if I'm in charge and somebody's writing my history, I'm going to make sure Garfield was actually Dr. Benite's teacher, and he taught him everything about the lost tribes. I'm going to be telling that story. I taught all the scholars that came on. I'm going to give my Ray Pizza story that makes me out to be this master teacher of biblical theology and history, and I don't think a believer is going to get that. I don't think that. I think and my thing is, Dr. Benite, I don't care what you believe. I don't want to know. That's your business. But for you to condemn people in public, oh, you don't believe in the Torah, you going to hell, or Yahweh is going to get you, or whatever. That's the people who I have a problem with, who I really think needs to hear the historical perspective.
Yeah. But, maybe we can find a common ground, I mean, there's a joke that says, how does heaven and hell work? So they say that, God, everybody arrives in the same place, and God forces everybody to study the Torah forever. Now, for the believers, it's heaven because that's what they want to do. Mm-hmm. And for the sinners, it's hell because they don't want to do that. Okay? But everybody is in the same place and no one's suffering too much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hold on, let me see if there's any more questions. Come on, guys. We don't have all day. Let me see. Shout out to Alexis Williams, by the way. Good to see you, sis. Yes, they're the only ones since the 70s. All right. Where was the place where to find that? Is the Ethiopia in the Bible the same as the modern Ethiopia of today?
Part of it, yes. Yeah. Part of it, certainly, yes. we have different understanding of that. For example, it is the territory between Egypt and Ethiopia mostly. Okay, and there are several references. For example, when you read, by the way, this is amazing how it works. You know, there is an enigmatic verse in the book of Amos 8:8 where he says, you know, you Israelites are to me like the Cushites. You know, like the people come from that area. You know, or the book of Esther says that the Persian Empire was from India to Kush. In other words, from India to Ethiopia, stretched. And in fact, it is kind of true if you think about, like, for example, this is the, let me give you the map again of the Assyrian Empire. I'm just going to use that. Like, imagine that the Persian Empire is to the east of that, but they, in fact, at their height, they had part of Egypt as well, all the way to southern Egypt. So the Bible, the geography of the Bible in the book of Esther is actually correct in terms of that. So is it all of Ethiopia? Certainly not. But is it part of today's Ethiopia? Certainly yes.
Okay. All right. Let me see what else. Any other questions? Ethiopians are not Israel. They are since they were so like. All right. I think I'm gonna leave it right there, man. I don't see any more important questions. But I would definitely, I know you're a busy guy in a semester and a lot of different things going on. If you do have the time, I definitely would want you to come back, whether in April or May.
We should stay in touch anyway. I mean, it is very rare for historians to actually come in contact with an interested public.
Right.
You know, I mean, the greatest thing ever happened to me with this book is that one Mormon group recommended it as the best present for Christmas. You know, and in the academic world, you know, it doesn't happen to you. You know, you want someone to mention you. You want, you know, someone to give you a prize. You know that, but sometimes it's the real thing. You know, when the public reads your stuff and say, "Well, we can engage that." You know.
You know, it's funny. I have your book up, right? And I said I would ask you questions based off of the contents and how you have it up. But I didn't have to even look at the book. It's like it does just flowing naturally. I'm pretty much deep into this 12 tribes whole thing. Can you stop sharing for a second? I wanted to let the people see something about your book. And the book is on the screen, ladies and gentlemen. It's called The 10 Lost Tribes, A World History. Dr. Benite did a wonderful job as far as showing it from a geographic perspective, but he gets into a lot of this. You see the map here on the front page. And if you look at the table of contents, you see the book is definitely a reader. There's a chapter called, there's 2 chapters that are the most important to me, actually 3. But an enclosed nation in Arzareth and Sambation, and tricksters and travels, and the conclusion. Well, I wouldn't call the conclusion a chapter, but the conclusion really breaks down a lot of different things of different people and different things that's going on with that. But the book is an amazing book, and I would suggest anybody to purchase this book. It's definitely something that you have to have in your library, because you can't answer some questions. You won't be able to answer every single question. Like what we talked about today, how he put it as far as the lecture today and everything is very informative. I mean, it's if you don't want to read the book, of course, you could go back and listen to what he spoke about. But trust me, this book here is something that everybody that's listening or watch this broadcast need to purchase. It's a hell of a book. It's a hell of a book with resources that's unbelievable. One more thing, you're laughing at
my
me.
brother. I should write a book every week and come on your show.
You know, my book is coming out pretty soon. I'm going to say
we'll talk.
On the Lost Tribes and have you look at it and let me know, because I do use your work. I quote a lot of stuff out of your book.
Yeah.
You know, there's a chapter you have about the tricksters and so
Yeah.
forth, and Eldad the Danite is in there. And the funniest thing, I talked about it earlier, was he said that they were fattening him up to eat it.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the, if you don't think there's something wrong with that story, just to listen to it is like the most amazing thing.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I read that part, I said, I was imagining it like, you know, remember when we were kids, we had all of these cartoons about, you know, people who are being eaten by cannibals and how they put them in the bowl and they make soup and all of that stuff. And I was thinking about how he could imagine all of these things. You know, he had a vivid imagination. He said, they kept me here for 4 months, so I become fat, you know?
Wow.
Yeah.
Hey, folks out there, this man here is unbelievable. We're going to be in touch. I'm going to send you my number later. Maybe we could talk.
Please, by all means. And if you need more sources, by the way, I would like, you have a huge archive, you know, of all of the stuff about Ephraim and Manasseh, you know, that I consulted for before we have the show. I still have it. And, you know, if anybody's interested, I have maps.
I'm interested. I don't know about anybody else.
Got it. You got it.
Sources. I'm very.
You got it. So you and I should have a rendezvous at the Reel's Raised Pizza. Okay. But you have to find which one. You have to find which one.
Oh, man. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a great dialogue. And Dr. Benny is very busy, very, very, very busy. And I do want to say, everybody, go back, listen to the lecture, get his book, get the sources so you could see for yourself. He's not making it up. I'm not making it up. There's sources. The whole Prester John stuff and Eldad the Danite, and you know, hold on. Let me ask you a personal question. This is kind of off topic, but do you think? And I don't really mean to put you on the spot, but the Ethiopian Jews, I don't think personally, and let me just tell you right now, I don't think they're connected at all. That's just me. I think later on, it's obvious when you read. There's writings, there's a particular Old Testament version. I read it years ago, like 10 years ago, where they said that you could see that there's some Geese words or something to that effect. I don't know how deep your studies are with the Ethiopians, but it seems like Christianity was there. There's no doubt in my mind.
Yeah.
We have the tradition of Philip and so forth in the New Testament. But what do you think about? Because when I look at the Aksum Empire, that is a huge geographic spot. Because when you look at the Demid Empire, it wasn't as big. And, you know, we have the king's list, so we could tell who was a king in the region in charge of Meroe and so forth. There's a lot of archaeology out there. But how do you think they eventually became Hebrews or got Judaism in there?
You know, there are many theories, and there's a book that talks about that. And you know, in the beginning of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of people went there and were looking at that. And we know two things. We know that the Beta Israel and the Jews of Ethiopia have been maintaining for many centuries, you know, that they have a link and they are a part of the Jewish people, and this should be accepted. Of course, it was accepted by, you know, today's authority, that they are, you know, today's authority about who discusses who's a Jew is the state of Israel. You know, this is also something that never happened before in history. You didn't have a government that decided that, you know, it's stories that ran. We don't know exactly where we came from. Mm-hmm. So as far, you know, I accept, you know, everybody, you know, and I don't think that it is to be a Jew is a matter of a specific location, you know, or a specific origin. I don't think that the Bible is understanding it in this way. Okay. But in the book, I talk about why people started to believe that regardless of the Ethiopian Jews, why people started to believe, you know, that, you know, the lost tribes are in Ethiopia. And that's a separate question. Sometimes it is conflated, but it's a separate question. It's precisely because of the Eldad the Danite and other people who claim that they have passed to this area, and also legends about Ethiopia that existed already before that. Now, I would say that it doesn't really matter now. It matters now, that when we become united, is how we live together in equality.
Right.
And I'm not going to discredit anybody.
Right.
I mean, you have people who say, if you came from, Poland and you maybe not part of the Jewish people, you came from here, you maybe not part of everybody has a claim to authenticity. Everybody is the real raised pizza. Yes.
Like in Ethiopia, you have the Agar people and you have the Falasha, the Beta Israel. I don't know. I just feel, what? Maybe I needed to word that. Anyone, in my opinion, can be a Jew. I could convert tomorrow and decide, hey, I'm going to be a Jew. Anyone could be a Jew. And I think people forget that it's a trading religion, but it's also a converting religion, meaning that people are going to convert. It's not a big deal. It's just like if someone decides, hey, I'm going to be a Christian, you're converting to be a Christian, or if you want to be a Muslim or a Hindu, etc. I think they are Jews there, but I found it pretty strange that from a ethnical ancient Israelite background, I found it kind of crazy that they couldn't speak Hebrew or didn't know any Hebrew, over the years, and that people came in and taught them Hebrew. I found that very weird. If you're saying you're ethnically connected to the original or the ancient Israelites, I found that even if you could claim you the tribe of Garfield or the tribe of Dr. Benite. I don't care. The point is, for you not knowing Hebrew was kind of like a head scratcher for me.
Right. But, at the end, we sometimes say we need to accept, what people tell about themselves, and that is the most important thing. And perhaps the beautiful thing is that even though, there were many disputes in the beginning of the 20th century, it is a matter of dispute.
Mm-hmm.
And it is connected to questions of race, because people believe how the Jewish race should be. And people write about, how the Hebrew language should sound. Okay. So I can show you also that most of these are in Hebrew, but there are debates when, people begin to speak Hebrew again. There are debates, in mandatory Palestine, does the Hebrew should sound like Arabic?
Right.
Or should it sound like a European language? And very, very important people wrote very important books that said, okay, Hebrew should sound like a European language, which is, of course, nonsense. Okay.
Right.
As a Semitic language is probably more closer in the sounds, to the way Arabic sounds, to the way that we spoke Hebrew at home, is a Hebrew that sounds like Arabic in terms of its sounds,
Vocalizations, right.
Yes.
Right. Any last questions, people, before Dr. Benite goes? Let me see. Sister Mika, you got a question? Or did Khazaria's Jewish Association spark rumors of the lost tribes during the Middle Ages?
Yes and no. Okay, the Khazarians is a big debate as well. It keeps resurfacing every time. And again, people use that. The fact is that the Khazarian elite in the 10th century probably converted to Judaism. And the fact is that you have some Khazarian words that migrated into the Yiddish, linguists found it, and we have some names that, originate in a Khazarian language. It seems to me that after the Khazarian Empire disappeared, they were most of the people that became Muslim or became Pravoslav Christians. Yes, and maybe some of them migrated and joined, the Jews of Eastern Europe and elsewhere. That's about the Khazarians. They're not the lost tribes, but precisely because this is an instance in history of a non-Jewish Israelites, yes, it became attached or lumped together sometimes with the lost tribes. Because remember, the lost tribes give you a nice, comfortable way to be a Jew without being a Jew. So this is how sometimes this is attached to that. You mentioned the Radhanites. It is the same case. We need to understand that in the history of human history, things move a lot all the time, and we struggle to look back at the past and reorganize it in a way that suits us. Yes.
I have one group. I feel is the lost tribes. We didn't talk about it the whole show.
Yeah, what's that?
The Jamaican Rastafarians. That's it.
Okay. First of all, I grew up on the, I mean, when I was a teenager, and today too, this culture was very, very strong, and very loved in where I was growing up. But I think that, one of the interesting things about the Jamaican and, the Afro-Caribbean understanding of it is because what they took is the myth of Babylon as a symbol of evil. And then when you have Babylon as a symbol of evil that migrates, Babylon can be anywhere, Babylon could be, could be today, it used to be in New York, it used to be Rome, and today to be New York. It's the place, it's the where you associate with evil. I don't say that New York is evil, God forbid, but I mean, it is the symbol of evil. And then, next to it, you have Zion, yes, as a symbol of purity, of restoration, of good life, and of good, and good of inspiration. And that Zion doesn't have to be the real Jerusalem. It is a second Jerusalem. It is a Jerusalem that migrates. And I think that what the Rastafarian culture, if I may speak about it as an external observer, it is one of the most beautiful interpretations of this culture of the battle between evil and good that we do using this symbolism. I remember that one of the earliest records that I ever bought in my life, when my father finally gave me some money to buy a record player, was Babylon by Bus. Yes. Okay. And I remember walking home and wondering, how do you get to Babylon by bus? Yes. Because for me, Babylon represented something different. My parents came from Babylon, I mean, it's, so it's, how do you get there? It's like something yet so clear, so close and so far, but in fact that it is inspired a whole movement. Yes. Of course they know where Babylon is, and of course they know where Zion is, but these are places that you carry in your heart because of the struggle between good and evil.
Yeah, definitely. But I think they're the only real ones. No, I'm just kidding.
As we say, you always have the real one.
The raised pizza. All right, man. I'm gonna let you go. We've been on for hours. I'm gonna definitely email you later, and we're gonna exchange numbers, and we're gonna put some stuff together.
Yeah, and let's be soon. I'm gonna organize you like a big box of stuff, to read.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you, man. I appreciate you for coming on. Ladies and gentlemen,
God bless everybody. Yeah, enjoy the weekend and stay safe.
Yes, sir. Peace.
Stay safe. Peace.
All right.
Bye-bye.
All right, ladies.